Good evening, dear listener. Midnight Cat is here, padding softly through the quiet halls of history, where old stones hold the warmth of long-vanished fires, and moonlight rests upon roofs of timber and thatch. Settle deeper into your bed, let the room around you grow still, and imagine that somewhere beyond the window the modern world has gently faded away. Tonight, we are traveling to medieval England. Not to the court of a king or the field of a famous battle, but to a small village where most lives passed without ever entering a chronicle. We will follow the slow rhythm of a single ordinary day, from the first pale light before sunrise until darkness gathers again beneath the stars. And there is a quiet mystery in such a day. History remembers coronations, sieges, royal marriages, and rebellions. Yet almost everyone who lived in medieval England experienced none of these things directly. Their world was made instead from bread dough and muddy lanes, church bells and wood smoke, winter stores and summer fields. What did morning feel like when there were no clocks on the wall, no glass windows in most cottages, no engines beyond the hedges? How did a person know when to rise, when to work, when to rest, and when the day was truly finished? To discover that, let us enter England in the 14th century, into a farming village lying among low green fields somewhere in the gentle country of the Midlands. Before dawn, the village is almost entirely dark. A faint ember glows beneath ash in the hearth of one cottage, no brighter than the eye of a sleeping animal. The house is small, built from a timber frame filled with woven wattle and covered in clay daub. Its roof, thick with straw thatch, slopes low against rain and wind. There is no chimney, as we would recognize one. Smoke from yesterday's fire has found its way upward through gaps and openings, darkening the rafters over many years. Inside, Thomas wakes before the sun. He is not awakened by a clock, but by habit, by the cold, and perhaps by the restless movement of a hen somewhere near the wall. Families in such villages often share their buildings with animals or keep them very close, especially when weather is harsh. Warmth is precious, and medieval cottages are not designed for privacy. Thomas lies for a moment beneath a rough woolen blanket. Beside him, his wife Alice is still asleep. Their youngest child has curled closer to her during the night. Across the dim room, another child breathes steadily on a straw-filled mattress. Outside, a cock begins to call. Thomas rises. The packed earth floor is cold beneath his feet. He pulls on a linen shirt that has been worn for several days, and then a woolen tunic. Clothing is valuable. A garment represents sheep, shearing, spinning, weaving, dyeing, cutting, stitching, and many hours of labor. Nothing is casually discarded. Cloth may be patched until the original fabric nearly disappears beneath repairs. He crouches beside the hearth and moves the gray ash with a small piece of wood. A coal survives below it. This is fortunate. Making fire can be done with flint and steel, but preserving embers overnight is easier. Thomas places dry material around the glow, bends close, and breathes steadily. A thread of smoke rises. Then comes a tiny flame. The room slowly returns to life. Alice wakes and wraps her clothing around herself against the morning chill. There is little conversation. Much of the household's routine is so familiar that words are unnecessary. She places a pot near the fire while Thomas steps outside. The air smells of damp earth. Mist lies over the fields beyond the houses, pale and low beneath the fading stars. The village is not large. Perhaps a few dozen households stand along a track that becomes deeply muddy after rain. Nearby are barns, sheds, fenced gardens, pigsties, and stacks of firewood. Beyond them lie the cultivated strips of the open fields. Thomas pauses. In the distance stands the church. Its shape is darker than the sky, its stone tower one of the strongest structures in the settlement. The church marks more than religion. Its bells help divide the day, Its building gathers the community, and its calendar gives shape to the year through Sundays, saints' days, fasts, and festivals. Soon the first bell sounds. The note moves across the damp countryside with surprising clarity. One bell, then another. Doors open. Figures appear in the gray morning. A boy drives two sleepy cattle toward a patch of common grazing. A woman carries a wooden bucket toward the well. Somewhere behind a cottage, a pig complains loudly at being disturbed. Dogs begin to move through the lane, sniffing at doors and heaps of straw. Thomas crosses to the small enclosure beside his house. He checks the family's few animals, then walks toward the village well with a bucket. Fresh water must be carried. No pipe brings it indoors. Every pot used for drinking, washing, cooking, or brewing begins with someone lifting water and bearing its weight home. At the well, he meets his neighbor, William, who gives him a quiet nod. They speak briefly about the weather. The sky in the east is turning pearl gray with a thin band of yellow beneath the cloud. For farmers, weather is not a matter of casual conversation alone. It touches almost everything. Too much rain may rot crops. Too little may reduce the harvest. A late frost can damage spring growth. Hay must be cut when several dry days can be trusted. This morning looks mild. Thomas carries the water home. Inside, Alice has prepared breakfast, simple and warm. There is pottage, a thick mixture whose ingredients change with season and household. Today it contains oats, onions, and a little cabbage. In wealthier homes there may be fine white bread and generous meat, but here bread is darker, made from grains such as rye, barley, or mixed wheat depending on what the household can obtain. They eat from wooden bowls. The children wake fully now. Their eldest son, John, is old enough to work alongside his father for part of the day. Childhood in medieval England is certainly recognized as a stage of life, yet children also become useful contributors to household labor at ages that may seem young to us. They watch animals, fetch water, gather wood, scare birds from grain, carry messages, and gradually learn the work that will support them as adults. Alice tears bread into smaller pieces for the youngest child. The fire crackles softly. Through a small opening in the wall, morning finally begins to enter the cottage. There is no hurried departure at an exact minute. No one checks the hour. Time here is understood through light, bells, meals, tasks, and the movement of the sun. Yet the household cannot linger. The day's work is waiting. Thomas takes a wooden-handled tool from beside the wall. John follows him outside. Alice remains behind for a while. Her own labor will be no lighter. She must tend the younger child, prepare food, maintain the fire, care for poultry, perhaps brew ale, mend clothing, work in the garden, spin fiber when time permits, and join seasonal agricultural work when needed. Medieval village life does not divide neatly into modern categories of home and workplace. The household itself is a place of constant production. Outside, the mist is lifting. Now you can see the village more clearly. Smoke rises slowly above thatched roofs. Dew shines on weeds beside the lane. A cart stands near a barn, its wooden wheels thick and heavy. Somewhere a mallet strikes timber with a dull, measured sound. A flock of geese moves indignantly through the mud, as though the entire road belongs to them. Thomas and John walk toward the fields. They pass the churchyard and the manor buildings beyond. The land around the village is divided by custom, obligation, and long memory. Thomas is not simply farming wherever he wishes. Like many villagers, he works strips scattered through larger open fields, and also owes certain duties connected to the local lord's estate. The exact arrangements differ from manor to manor, and medieval rural society is far more varied than a single tidy system might suggest. But this morning, Thomas is going to one of the strips his household depends upon. The path rises slightly. Behind him, the village settles into its daylight rhythm. Ahead lies a broad field striped with narrow holdings, green and brown beneath the growing sun. Larks begin to sing somewhere above, invisible in the brightness. John walks beside his father without speaking. Their boots darken with dew, and as they reach the first furrows, the sun finally clears the distant hedge, touching the wet earth with a pale golden light. Thomas stops at the edge of the strip and looks down at the soil. To a stranger, the field might seem almost empty, only a long stretch of earth marked by shallow ridges and the faint green of new growth. To him, it is full of information. He can see where water collected after the last rain, where the soil is heavier, where weeds have begun to crowd the crop, and where a few plants have failed altogether. He knows the land not as a map, but as a collection of remembered seasons. John waits while his father presses a clod apart with his fingers. The earth is damp, but not waterlogged. They begin. The work this morning is ordinary maintenance rather than harvest, and that makes it no less important. Weeds must be removed where they threaten the grain. Small channels need clearing so that standing water does not linger. At another time of year there might be plowing, sowing, haymaking, reaping, threshing, or the difficult business of bringing in crops before rain arrives. Agricultural life changes constantly with the season, and a medieval household's daily rhythm follows that change. Thomas bends steadily over the strip. John works a little faster, then slows when he notices his father's pace. The sun rises higher. Across the open fields, other villagers are doing much the same. Their strips lie side by side without the hedges that divide many later English farms. Here and there, people call to one another. A dog runs along the boundary, stops to inspect a tuft of grass, and then races away with no clear purpose. From this distance, the village roofs seem almost to grow from the earth. A church bell sounds again. Thomas straightens his back. The bell is not an exact clock in the modern sense, yet its voice is familiar enough to help organize the day. Medieval people measure time in many ways, by canonical hours, by the position of the sun, by meals, by shadows, by customary routines. In towns, mechanical clocks will gradually become more visible during the later Middle Ages, but here, the movement of daylight still matters more than numbered minutes. John points toward the road. A small group of travelers is passing beyond the field. One is riding a horse. Two others walk beside a pack animal carrying the bundles wrapped in cloth. They may be merchants, servants, pilgrims, or men traveling on business connected to an estate. Roads bind medieval England together more than we sometimes imagine, though journeys can be slow and uncomfortable. News, goods, rumors, songs, legal summonses, and stories travel with people. For a moment, John watches them. Perhaps he wonders where the road goes after it disappears beyond the trees. Thomas does not hurry him. A village life may appear narrow from far away, yet its inhabitants are not necessarily ignorant of a wider world. Markets bring strangers. Priests hear news. Lords and officials travel. Soldiers return. Pilgrims pass through. Relatives marry into distant settlements. Coins bearing the king's name move from hand to hand. Still, most days remain local. The travelers vanish. Father and son return to the earth. By mid-morning, the mist has entirely burned away. The sky is a washed blue, and insects drift over the warmer ground. Thomas removes his outer layer and lays it on the grass. John drinks from a small vessel they have brought with them. At the cottage, Alice's morning has become equally busy. The youngest child sits near the doorway, turning a smooth piece of wood between both hands. Alice has already swept part of the floor and fed scraps to the hens. Now she is working with dough. Bread is central to the household, but baking arrangements vary. Some villages possess communal or manorial ovens, while smaller loaves and other foods can be prepared closer to home depending on local custom and equipment. Grain itself must first be ground, often at a mill where tenants may be required by custom to take their corn. Nothing about a loaf is effortless. The grain has been planted, tended, harvested, dried, threshed, winnowed, transported, ground, mixed, kneaded, and baked. Alice presses the dough with the heels of her hands. The room smells of flour, smoke, and yesterday's onions. Her daughter Margaret, not yet grown but old enough for careful work, sits nearby with wool across her lap. She is learning skills she has watched since early childhood. Spinning is patient work. A household requires enormous quantities of thread over the years, and textiles consume countless hours that rarely appear in chronicles. Alice glances at the door. The weather is holding. That matters because she intends to wash several pieces of clothing later, though washing clothes is a more laborious business than the phrase suggests. Water must be carried or the garments taken to water. Soap may be made from fats and alkaline substances, while other cleaning methods depend on means, custom, and fabric. Clothing cannot simply be replaced when stained or worn. There is a sudden commotion outside. Margaret rises. A goose has found its way into the garden. It stands among the vegetables with the calm satisfaction of a creature that believes it has discovered a private feast. Alice rushes out, waving both hands. The goose moves exactly 3 steps. She waves again. It gives a low protesting sound and finally retreats toward the lane, leaving one young leaf damaged behind it. Margaret laughs. Alice tries not to, but fails. For a few moments, the medieval morning feels wonderfully familiar. There are taxes to consider, obligations to fulfill, crops to protect, illnesses to fear, and uncertain harvests ahead. Yet life is not lived every hour beneath the weight of historical seriousness. People tease one another. Children chase animals. Neighbors exchange gossip. Someone makes a foolish mistake at work and hears about it for weeks. The past contains boredom, irritation, affection, embarrassment, and laughter just as surely as it contains kings. Near midday, Alice gathers food into a cloth and sends Margaret toward the fields. The girl follows the lane past the churchyard. As she walks, the village is busier than it was at dawn. Near one cottage, a man repairs a part of a wooden cart. The wheel has been removed and lies against a wall. At another house, an elderly woman sits in the sun plucking feathers from a bird. 2 small children play beside a ditch, constructing some mysterious kingdom from sticks and stones. Margaret passes the manor's barn. Its size is impressive beside the cottages. Structures like this hold the agricultural wealth upon which much of the local economy depends. Grain, hay, tools, animals, rents, services, and obligations connect lord and tenant in patterns that may be cooperative in some moments and deeply unequal in others. Near the church gate, she sees the parish priest speaking with a villager. The church is woven into everyday existence. Baptism, marriage, burial, feast days, fast days, confession, mass, bells, processions, and local devotion give medieval communities a spiritual calendar layered over the agricultural one. Religious belief is not a separate Sunday subject. For many people, it provides the language through which fortune, suffering, duty, death, hope, and the natural world are understood. Margaret lowers her eyes respectfully as she passes. Soon, the stone walls of the church fall behind her. She walks out into open sunlight. Thomas sees her coming. He and John have stopped beneath the small shade of a tree near the field's edge. Another worker joins them, then a second. The midday meal is not elaborate. There is bread, cheese, and a little onion. Alice has included a small amount of cold pottage, thick enough to carry in a vessel. Thomas breaks the bread. The crust is firm. They eat slowly. Ale is common in medieval England, including varieties weaker than later people might expect, though water is also consumed where it is available and considered suitable. Brewing is an important household skill, and in many communities, a small-scale trade practiced especially by women. Quality varies. So does strength. John is hungry enough to eat almost anything. Margaret tells them about the goose. Thomas smiles. John asks whether it escaped with the cabbage. "No," she says. It is almost the longest conversation anyone has had all morning. The field around them grows quiet beneath the noon warmth. Somewhere in the distance a hammer continues its steady rhythm. A bee moves through tiny flowers beside the path. The scent of grass mixes with warm soil and wool. Thomas leans back against the tree. For a little while, nobody works. There is no need to fill the silence. Above them, clouds move slowly across an immense summer sky, and beyond the field the church tower rests over the village like a familiar stone marker, waiting for the bell that will eventually call them onward into the long afternoon. The bell comes at last, its deep note rolling outward over the fields. Thomas opens his eyes. He has not been asleep, only resting in the warm shade with his hands folded loosely over his stomach. Around him, the others begin to move again. Breadcrumbs are brushed from tunics. A wooden cup is returned to a bag. John gets to his feet with the sudden energy of youth, while Thomas rises more carefully and stretches the stiffness from his back. The afternoon work begins beneath a brighter sun. Heat gathers over the open fields, and the smell of earth becomes stronger. Insects hum among the grasses beside the track. From far off comes the slow creak of a cart making its way toward the village, the sound appearing and disappearing whenever the wind changes. Thomas works with measured patience. There is little sense of racing against numbered hours, yet there is always a quiet awareness of daylight. What cannot be completed before evening may have to wait until tomorrow, and tomorrow will bring its own duties. In a farming household, work has a way of renewing itself. John moves toward the far end of the strip. Every so often he straightens and looks toward the distant trees. Beyond those trees lies woodland, used in ways carefully shaped by custom. Medieval woods are not simply wild spaces untouched by people. They provide fallen branches for fuel, timber for building, grazing for animals in some seasons, nuts, berries, herbs, and materials for countless ordinary objects. Rights to use such resources can be tightly regulated, and disputes over them are not uncommon. To a village household, a wood may be as practical as a storehouse. Later in the year, pigs might be driven beneath oak and beech trees to feed on fallen mast where local rights permit it. Children may gather small branches. Men cut timber under customary rules. Women collect plants known through generations of household practice. The landscape is worked, remembered, and named. By the middle of the afternoon, Thomas decides that he and John have done enough in this field. They gather their tools and begin walking home. Margaret has already returned to help Alice, so father and son follow the path alone. Their pace is unhurried. The light has softened slightly, though several hours remain before sunset. Near the village, they meet the cart whose creaking they heard earlier. A man leads the horse while another walks beside the wheel. Several sacks rest in the cart bed, probably grain or meal. The horse lowers its head as it passes, leather harness dark with sweat. Thomas steps aside. The cart rolls on. Its wheels have carved deep ruts into the lane, where yesterday's rain still glistens in small brown pools. Outside one cottage, a neighbor named Edith is sitting on a low stool with a basket of peas. Her fingers move quickly as she opens each pod. She calls a greeting. Thomas answers. John continues a few steps before his father tells him to stop. Edith has heard that a trader may come through the village tomorrow on his way toward a nearby market town. Whether this is true or simply one of those rumors that grows as it travels is uncertain. Still, the possibility interests her. She needs a new needle if the price is not unreasonable. Such small objects can matter greatly. A good iron needle is easy to overlook in a modern room filled with manufactured things, But here it is, a precise and useful possession. Metal goods require skilled work. Pots, knives, hinges, nails, buckles, horseshoes, tools, and blades all connect the village to craftsmen whose labor is essential. Thomas says he will listen for news of the trader. Then he and John continue home. Alice is outside when they arrive. Several pieces of damp cloth hang where the afternoon air can reach them. Margaret sits nearby with the younger child, showing him how to arrange pebbles in a circle. Thomas leaves his tool beneath the shelter of the eaves. The household does not become idle simply because the field work is over. A section of fence beside the garden has begun to lean, and before supper Thomas wants to strengthen it. If another goose enters, Alice has informed him, it will be entirely his responsibility. Thomas examines the fence. He says nothing. John tries not to smile. The repair is simple. A post has loosened in the damp ground. Thomas drives it firmer and binds a part of the structure with flexible material kept for such uses. Medieval homes depend continually on repair. Wood splits, thatch loosens, walls crack, handles break, shoes wear through, buckets leak. Few objects are perfectly finished and then forgotten. They survive through attention. Inside the cottage, Allison prepares the evening meal. The fire has burned low, so Margaret adds small pieces of dry wood. Smoke curls upward and gathers briefly near the rafters before finding its way out. Light from the doorway crosses the floor in a broad, golden shape. The main pot is placed above the fire. Pottage again. This repetition would be familiar to many medieval villagers. The dish is not necessarily identical from one meal to the next. It changes according to what is available. Peas, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, herbs, grains, and occasionally meat or fat when the household possesses it. Today, Alice adds peas and a few garden herbs. The scent begins to fill the cottage. Thomas comes inside carrying a broken wooden spoon. Alice looks at him. The spoon has survived for years. Its handle has finally cracked. He sits near the doorway and begins smoothing a replacement from a piece of wood saved for small household objects. He is not a professional woodworker, but villagers often possess a wide range of practical skills. Buying every necessary object from a specialist would be impossible. John watches for a while. Then his attention drifts outside. Several boys are moving down the lane. One carries a ball roughly made from scraps of material. John looks at his father. Thomas notices. There is still light before supper. He gives a small nod. John disappears through the doorway. Soon voices rise outside. The boys run across a patch of open ground, kicking and chasing the ball with rules understood only by themselves. Medieval games can be vigorous, and some forms of football in England will become notorious enough to attract official complaints and attempts at restriction. This village game, however, is modest. There are no crowds, no banners, only 6 boys, 1 battered ball, and a great deal of disagreement. The youngest child hears them and wanders toward the door. Margaret catches him before he can join. The church bell sounds once more. Its voice changes the mood of the village. The working day is beginning to fold inward. Animals must be brought closer to shelter. Tools are gathered. Fires are fed. People who have spent hours in distant fields return along familiar tracks. From where Thomas sits, he watches them. A woman carries a bundle of sticks tied with cord. 2 men walk together with tools over their shoulders. A girl guides a cow along the lane, tapping its flank gently when it pauses to inspect a hedge. The cow is in no hurry. Neither, now, is the village. Shadows lengthen. The stone church becomes warm with the low light. For a moment, if you were standing at the edge of the lane, the whole settlement might seem peaceful enough to belong to a painted manuscript. Thatched roofs shining gold, smoke drifting into a clear sky, swallows turning above the fields. but closer inspection would reveal the roughness too. Mud clings to shoes. Hands are calloused. Clothing is patched. The smell of livestock is everywhere. Life here is demanding, and a poor harvest or serious illness can place a household in danger. Medieval villagers live with forms of uncertainty that cannot simply be wished away. Yet this ordinary evening is not a tragedy. It is simply an evening, and that difference matters. Most people in the past, like most people now, experience history not as a succession of disasters and triumphs, but as days in which supper must be cooked, children must be called home, and tomorrow's work quietly waits. Alice steps to the doorway. She calls John. There is an immediate protest from the field, then another. Eventually, John returns, flushed and dusty. They gather around the evening meal. Bowls are filled. Thomas's new spoon is unfinished, so he uses another. The youngest child is already sleepy, leaning against Alice while trying to remain awake long enough to eat. Outside, the last sunlight slips from the lane. Inside, the hearth becomes the brightest thing in the cottage, and the family's shadows grow long against the walls as the medieval day begins its slow passage toward night. The fire settles into a steady glow. For a while, the only sounds inside the cottage are the scrape of wooden spoons against bowls, the occasional pop of damp wood in the hearth, and the quiet breathing of people who have worked since before sunrise. Evening does not arrive all at once. It gathers gradually in corners beneath the roof, around the doorway, until the family seems to be sitting inside a small island of firelight. Alice finishes first. She takes the youngest child onto her lap and wipes a little pottage from his chin with the edge of a cloth. His eyes are already half closed. Margaret eats more slowly, while John, hungry after his afternoon game, asks for another piece of bread. Thomas watches the loaf diminish. Bread must last. He cuts a modest piece and gives it to the boy. Nothing in the household is wasted casually. Crumbs may be gathered. Bones, when there are bones, can be boiled. Fat is useful for cooking, lighting, and other household purposes. Old cloth becomes patches. Broken pottery may find some secondary use. Ash from the hearth is not merely dirt to be discarded, and even worn objects can remain valuable long after their first purpose has ended. When supper is finished, Alice covers what remains in the pot. There will be food for morning. Outside, the village is becoming quieter, though not yet silent. Thomas steps through the doorway. The air has cooled quickly since sunset. A violet color rests above the western fields, and the first bright star has appeared over the dark line of trees. Smoke lies low between the houses. Somewhere nearby, a cow shifts its weight and knocks softly against a wooden barrier. John follows his father. There is one final task before darkness closes fully around them. The household's animals must be checked. A hen has already settled awkwardly upon a perch. Another is still scratching in the dirt, as if refusing to believe the day is over. Thomas guides it toward shelter with the patient irritation of someone who has repeated the same action hundreds of times. John closes the fastening. The village dogs have changed their character with evening. During daylight they wander, bark, and investigate. Now they become shadowy guardians near doors and yards, lifting their heads whenever footsteps approach. Farther down the lane, someone laughs. A door shuts. Then the church bell sounds. Its voice is deeper in darkness. The notes move out across the fields where Thomas and John worked earlier, across strips of grain and meadow, across the road where the travelers passed, and toward scattered farms beyond the village. For those who hear it, the bell is a familiar companion, calling attention back to an ordered world of prayer, community, and passing time. Thomas stands still until the sound fades. He is tired. His shoulders ache pleasantly rather than painfully, and the skin on his hands feels dry from soil and work. Tomorrow, if the weather holds, there will be more to do. There is always more to do. but the field can wait until morning. He and John return inside. Alice has placed a small rushlight near the hearth. Such light is precious and limited. A rushlight can be made by drying the pith of a rush and drawing it through fat or grease, producing a slender flame. Candles exist, of course, but good beeswax candles are costly, while tallow gives a cheaper alternative. In a household like this, firelight itself remains important. The small flame gives less light than a modern person might expect. The room is full of shadow. Faces brighten when they lean toward the hearth and disappear when they move away. This shapes evening life. Work requiring fine vision becomes more difficult once daylight is gone. Some spinning, mending, or small tasks may continue near the fire, but darkness encourages a slowing of activity. The household enters a quieter rhythm because the natural world has done so. Margaret sits beside Alice. A torn place in John's clothing needs mending. Alice threads a needle. The metal catches the firelight for an instant. It is precisely the sort of needle Edith hopes to buy from the rumored trader tomorrow. A tiny object whose usefulness is far greater than its size. Margaret watches her mother's hands. The movement is practiced, almost automatic. Thomas takes up the piece of wood he began shaping earlier and works carefully at the spoon. His knife makes small, controlled cuts. Thin curls fall onto the floor near his feet. John sits against the wall. For several minutes he tries to follow what his father is doing. Then he begins to yawn. Nobody suggests that he must remain awake simply because the adults are still busy. The medieval sleeping day often follows light more closely than ours does. Patterns vary by household, season, occupation, and circumstance, but in a world where artificial illumination is limited, darkness has a greater authority. Alice finishes the repair. She examines the stitches. They will hold. The garment returns to John. Tomorrow it may collect more mud, catch on another branch, or endure another season of hard use. The little rushlight flickers. Thomas pauses in his carving. "Did you see the travelers?" John asks. Thomas nods. John has been thinking of them since morning. "Where do you think they were going?" Thomas looks toward the dark doorway. Perhaps to the market town. Perhaps farther. There are roads from there toward larger towns, and roads beyond those. If a traveler has enough reason, enough money, enough protection, and enough patience, England can unfold outward into a surprisingly connected world. Thomas names one nearby town. John considers this. To him, it sounds distant. Yet medieval England is full of movement. Farmers travel to markets. Craftsmen seek work. Clergy journey between religious houses and parishes. Merchants cross counties. Pilgrims undertake routes to local shrines or travel much farther, sometimes even beyond England. Royal messengers move rapidly by the standards of the age. Students go to places of learning. Sailors leave ports for France, the Low Countries, Iberia, Scandinavia, and beyond. Even someone who remains in one village may own or encounter things whose origins lie far away. Salt can travel inland from the coast. Wine may come from across the channel. Certain spices, available mostly to wealthier consumers and in smaller quantities, have crossed enormous distances through networks linking Europe with the eastern Mediterranean and Asia. A village is local. It is not isolated from the world. Thomas tells John that perhaps one day he will see the market town properly. John seems satisfied with this promise. Alice smiles without looking up. She has heard such promises before. The youngest child is asleep now. Alice carries him to the straw bedding and covers him. The others gradually prepare for sleep as well. There is no separate bedroom waiting behind a door. Space is shared closely. Privacy, in the modern sense, is limited. People sleep near one another because the house is small and because warmth matters. Before settling, Thomas steps outside once more. the village has changed completely. Without windows glowing brilliantly or lamps lining the road, darkness is deep. The sky seems enormous. Stars spread above the church tower in numbers that would be difficult to see from a brightly lit modern town. The Milky Way is a pale band across the heavens. Thomas knows none of its modern astronomy. To him, the sky belongs to a world understood through Christian teaching, inherited tradition, practical observation, and the great mystery common to all people who have ever looked upward at night. The moon has not yet risen. A few windows show dim orange firelight. Somewhere beyond the village, an owl calls. Another answers. Thomas breathes in the cool air. The smell of smoke is mixed with grass, manure, damp soil, and the faint sweetness of hay stored nearby. For a moment, imagine standing beside him. There is no distant traffic, no electric hum, no aircraft moving silently among the stars. The loudest human sound is a muffled voice from another cottage. Beyond that lies the darkness of the fields. Beyond the fields, woods. Beyond the woods, other villages sleeping beneath the same sky. Thomas turns back inside. Alice has banked the fire carefully so that embers may survive beneath ash until morning. One by one, the small lights disappear. The family settles beneath wool and coarse linen. John murmurs something about the travelers, but nobody answers. Soon his breathing becomes slow. Margaret turns once in her sleep. The house creaks gently as the night air cools its timbers. Outside, the church tower stands invisible, except where its upper edge interrupts the stars. Hours pass without clocks announcing them. Then, sometime deep in the night, Thomas opens his eyes. The cottage is black. At first, he does not know what awakened him. He listens. A soft scratching comes from near the wall, perhaps a mouse. Then he hears rain. Only a few drops at first, touching the thatch with a faint whisper. Thomas lies still. More drops follow. The sound spreads across the roof. Tomorrow's field will be wet again. He thinks briefly of the soil, the drainage channel, and the work waiting there. But there is nothing he can do about it now. The roof holds. The fire sleeps under its ash. The children remain warm. Thomas closes his eyes. Above the cottage, rain settles gently over the village, darkening the empty lane, filling the cart ruts, and shining upon the old stones of the churchyard. And while medieval England sleeps, the fields quietly drink. By the time the rain begins to thin, the night has moved closer to morning. Thomas does not wake again immediately. The sound upon the thatch becomes softer, then irregular, until at last only an occasional drop falls from the eaves into the dark yard. Beneath the ash, one ember remains alive. Long before sunrise, Alice stirs. For a few moments she lies without moving, listening to the silence that follows rain. The air inside the cottage feels cooler and heavier than it did the evening before. Somewhere near the doorway, water drips with patient regularity. She rises carefully so as not to wake the children. The floor is cold. At the hearth, she kneels and draws away the upper layer of ash. A dull red glow answers her. She adds dry tinder kept away from the damp, then small pieces of wood. Smoke curls around her hands. Soon, a flame appears. The second morning of our village begins much as the first did, but no two mornings are truly identical. Outside, the world is wet. The lane shines faintly beneath the sky, still without color. Roofs drip. The garden leaves bend under beads of water. Puddles have deepened in the cart tracks, and the smell of damp earth seems to rise everywhere at once. Alice steps into the yard with a bucket. She looks toward the east. There is enough light there to suggest that dawn is not far away. Behind her, Thomas emerges from the cottage, fastening his tunic. He studies the clouds. The rain has passed for now, but the fields will be heavy. The work he expected to do may have to be altered. This is one of the quiet truths of agricultural life. plans are always provisional when weather decides otherwise. Thomas walks a little way down the lane. Another man is already outside, examining the sky. They exchange greetings and perhaps the oldest rural opinion in history, that the ground has had enough rain. Neither can prove what the afternoon will bring. Both will work accordingly. Inside, John wakes reluctantly. His legs ache from yesterday's work and play. For a few pleasant seconds he seems not to remember that another day has begun. Then the church bell reaches him through the walls. He opens his eyes. Margaret is already helping Alice. Breakfast is reheated pottage and bread, simpler even than yesterday's meal. The household eats while gray morning gathers beyond the doorway. Thomas tells John they will not go immediately to the same strip. Instead, there is work closer to the village. A section of boundary near a meadow needs attention, and afterward they may help with a task owed elsewhere on the manor, depending on what the reeve requires. The reeve is an important figure in many medieval manorial communities, often involved in supervising agricultural work and estate obligations. Arrangements differ greatly from place to place and across time, but villagers are accustomed to living within webs of customary responsibility. A man may cultivate land for his own household and still owe labor, rent, produce, or other dues, according to the terms under which he holds it. These obligations can feel ordinary because they are familiar. They can also become a source of resentment. Medieval rural society is not a timeless picture of everyone contentedly accepting a fixed station. Customs are argued over. Dues are resisted. Rights are remembered with remarkable precision. Villagers know the difference between what has long been owed and what they believe someone is trying newly to demand. Thomas, however, has no dispute to settle this morning. He finishes eating and stands. John follows. The rain has left a silver brightness on every surface. They walk toward the meadow, stepping around the deepest pools. Near Edith's cottage, the old woman from yesterday is already watching the lane. She remembers the rumored trader. So does Margaret. There is no sign of him yet. If he comes at all, it will likely be later, when roads are busier. Thomas and John continue beyond the last houses. The meadow lies lower than the cultivated fields. Water glistens in shallow places, and grasses bend beneath the weight of rain. Frogs move unseen near a ditch. The morning task is straightforward. A rough fence has sagged where soil around one of the posts softened. Livestock passing nearby could worsen the damage. Thomas tests the wood. John holds the post while his father works. Their boots sink slightly into the ground. Mud creeps around the edges of the leather. Medieval footwear, like clothing, varies according to wealth, occupation, fashion, and period. For villagers doing wet work, shoes are practical possessions continually exposed to hard use. Leather can be patched and repaired, but water and mud remain persistent enemies. John shifts his footing. The post moves. Thomas tells him to hold it steady. John does. A few minutes later, the fence stands firmer. From somewhere beyond the meadow comes a low chorus of cattle. Then the sun appears unexpectedly through a break in the cloud. Everything changes. Drops on the grass flash white. The church windows catch pale light. Steam seems almost to rise from the darker patches of earth. Thomas removes his cap and looks upward. Perhaps the day will clear after all. They begin walking back. As they approach the village, they hear voices. Something unusual is happening near the lane. John quickens his pace. Thomas does not stop him. A small pack horse has appeared beside the churchyard wall. Bundles hang from either side of its saddle, protected as well as possible from the wet. Beside it stands a man in a brown cloak speaking to several villagers. The trader has come. Edith is already there. Of course she is. She stands near the front with the focused patience of someone who has waited since yesterday for precisely this moment. The trader is not the wealthy merchant of a great city. He carries a modest selection of portable goods, the sorts of things that may be worth taking from settlement to settlement, where there is enough demand to make the journey worthwhile. When Thomas and John reach the group, several items have been laid carefully upon a cloth: buckles, needles, small knives, pins, lengths of cord, a few pieces of dyed cloth. Perhaps simple devotional objects. Nothing resembles treasure. Yet John stares as though a chest from some distant palace has been opened in the mud. Color alone is enough to catch his attention. Most of the clothing around him is practical and repeatedly worn. The little pieces of brighter cloth seem almost extravagant. Edith asks the price of a needle. The trader names it. She frowns. A quiet negotiation begins. This, too, is part of medieval village life. Money circulates, though not every exchange depends entirely upon coin. Wages, rents, goods, services, credit, and barter may overlap according to local circumstances. English coinage provides familiar denominations, but small purchases can still require careful thought in a household where cash is limited. Edith produces several coins. The trader examines them. John watches everything. He watches the man's hands. He watches the horse. He watches the buckles. Most of all, he watches the road behind the trader, wet and brown beneath the morning light. The man has traveled from somewhere John has not seen. That fact gives him an almost mysterious importance. Thomas notices his son's expression. The trader notices too. He asks John whether he likes the little knife lying on the cloth. John immediately looks at his father. Thomas asks the price. It is more than he intends to spend. He shakes his head. John tries not to look disappointed. Instead, Thomas points toward a small iron hook. This could actually be useful at home. The trader lifts it and names a lower price. Thomas considers. Alice has mentioned more than once that a better hook near the hearth would be welcome. He bargains mildly. The trader sighs in the theatrical manner of sellers who have been unfairly ruined by customers since markets first existed. Eventually, they agree. Thomas hands over the coins. The hook disappears into his pouch. John is fascinated that an ordinary morning has suddenly connected their cottage to the work of a smith he may never meet. Around them, the little gathering grows. Margaret arrives with Alice. Several children hover nearby. A man asks about a buckle. Another examines a blade. Edith has obtained her needle and holds it with great satisfaction. For perhaps half an hour, the village lane becomes a tiny marketplace. News travels with the goods. The trader has passed through a nearby town. He mentions road conditions, prices, a church roof under repair, and a rumor concerning a lord whose household may soon travel through the district. Some of what he says is reliable. Some may have changed in the telling. Nobody can know which immediately, but everyone listens. In a world without printed newspapers reaching ordinary rural homes, information moves through mouths, roads, markets, inns, churches, courts, and travelers such as this one. John stands very still. The wider world, which yesterday seemed to begin beyond the distant trees, has come for a moment directly into the lane. Then, as quietly as it arrived, it begins to pack itself away. The trader folds the cloth carefully over what remains of his goods. Needles vanish first, wrapped in a small scrap so they will not be lost. Buckles are gathered into a pouch. The knives are slid into coverings, their handles turned inward beneath the cloak. A length of bright cloth disappears last, and with it much of the color that had briefly transformed the muddy lane. The pack-horse shifts impatiently. Its ears turn toward every voice. The trader tightens one strap, checks another, and exchanges a final word with Edith, who has already tucked her new needle somewhere safe. She seems pleased enough with the bargain now, although only moments earlier she had behaved as though the price were an insult to generations of honest villagers. John remains near the road. He hopes, perhaps, that the man will say something extraordinary before leaving. Instead, the trader asks whether the road east is badly flooded. Thomas tells him that the lower stretch near the stream may be soft. The man nods. Practical knowledge is more valuable to a traveler than a dramatic farewell. He takes the horse's lead rope and starts walking. Several children follow for a short distance. John goes with them until Thomas calls his name. The boy stops. The trader continues along the wet road, the horse's hooves making quiet sucking sounds in the mud. Within minutes, the pair are beyond the last cottages. A little later, they pass the meadow. Eventually, even the brown cloak disappears behind the trees. The village returns to itself. Yet the morning does not feel quite as ordinary as it did before. Alice takes the iron hook from Thomas and turns it in her hand. It is a simple object, dark and slightly uneven, shaped by hammer and heat. She tests its weight with satisfaction. This evening, Thomas will fit it near the hearth. Margaret admires Edith's needle. John says nothing about the knife. Thomas notices that too. There will be other markets, other traders, other opportunities. A household cannot spend merely because something is desirable. Coin must be kept for rents, purchases, repairs, food in difficult seasons, and countless needs that cannot be predicted. For now, John has work. The reeve is waiting near the manor barn. Thomas and his son walk toward him. Rain has changed the planned labor. Instead of continuing certain field tasks, several men are being directed toward work around stored hay and drainage near one of the estate buildings. Water has entered where nobody wants it. The barn itself smells strongly of timber, straw, dust, and animals. Its interior is dim even in daylight. High above, heavy beams vanish into shadow. Such barns can be substantial structures, built to protect the crops and fodder upon which the estate depends. A leaking roof or wet floor is more than an inconvenience. Moisture can spoil what months of work have produced. Thomas joins two neighbors. They begin shifting material away from a damp section. John carries smaller bundles. Dust rises whenever dry straw is disturbed, catching in shafts of light from the doorway. A cat appears on one beam overhead. It sits with perfect calm, tail wrapped around its paws, watching the human beings labor below as though they have been placed there entirely for its amusement. John looks up. The cat looks down. Neither seems impressed by the other. Outside, the morning continues to brighten. The rain clouds are breaking into great white and gray shapes, and sunlight passes over the village in moving patches. Thomas works until sweat gathers beneath his tunic. The reeve comes through occasionally to inspect progress. He is not necessarily an outsider. In many manners, a reeve may be chosen or appointed from among the local tenants, someone familiar with the people and the land. This can make his position complicated. He belongs to the village world, and also carries responsibility for overseeing work owed to the manor. When he tells Thomas that another section must be cleared, Thomas does not argue. The task is reasonable. Not every interaction between authority and villager becomes a dispute. Most systems survive day after day through routine. By noon, the damp area has been opened enough for air to reach it. The men stop. Alice has sent food again, though today John carried it with them. They sit near the barn entrance where the ground is dry. The meal is bread, cheese, and a few peas left from the night before. One of the men has an apple stored longer than seems possible. He cuts it into pieces. The fruit is wrinkled and not especially sweet, but he offers slices around. John accepts one. The flavor is sharp. He eats every part except the seeds. From where they sit, the manor house is partly visible beyond a wall and several smaller buildings. It is more comfortable than Thomas's cottage, certainly, but it is not a royal palace. Medieval society contains many layers between a peasant household and a king. Lesser landowners, knights, clerics, prosperous townspeople, officials, craftsmen, merchants, servants, and tenants all occupy their own shifting positions. The lives of the wealthy differ greatly from Thomas's. Their meals may contain more meat, better bread, imported wine, and expensive spices. Their clothing may display finer wool, linen, fur, or silk. Their houses provide more rooms and greater privacy. Yet even the wealthy live without many things a modern child would regard as ordinary. Their nights are still dark. Their journeys still depend on animals, wind, water, and human feet. Illness still carries frightening uncertainty. Winter still matters. John finishes the apple. A bell sounds. The men rise once again. This time, Thomas sends John home. The boy has done enough, and Alice needs help. John is pleased by the decision. He walks back through the village with a lighter step. Near the church, he sees Edith again. She is sitting outside with her needle already at work. The trader's visit has become the subject of conversation around her. She claims she paid far less than he first asked. Another woman says she still paid too much. Edith replies that the other woman would not know a good needle if it stitched her sleeve to the table. John smiles and keeps walking. At home, Alice has begun another task. A small quantity of ale is being prepared. Brewing in medieval households can be frequent because ale does not necessarily keep for long, especially without modern methods of preservation. The process varies, and brewing can be done on different scales, but it requires grain, water, vessels, heat, skill, and time. For some women, brewing grows beyond household necessity into a source of income. Alice is not operating a large commercial enterprise. Still, she knows what she is doing. John is immediately given the least interesting part of the work. He carries water. The bucket is heavier than he would like. He makes several trips. On the final one, he stops beside the well and looks down. His reflection trembles faintly in the dark water. Then another face appears beside his. Margaret. She asks why he is staring into the well. John says he is thinking. She asks whether it is about the trader's knife. John turns away. Margaret laughs. They walk home together. The afternoon becomes warm and surprisingly pleasant. Rainwater begins to disappear from the lane, though the deepest ruts remain full. Hens return to scratching in the yard. Flies gather near the animals. Somewhere a baby cries, then stops. Alice works while the children move in and out of the cottage. The domestic day has its own complicated rhythm. Food preparation overlaps with cleaning. Childcare overlaps with spinning. Brewing overlaps with conversation at the door. A neighbor arrives to borrow something small and stays longer than necessary. News of the trader is discussed again. Then comes news from farther away. Someone has heard that a fair will soon be held near a town within walking distance, though attending would require planning and perhaps an early start. Margaret listens. John listens even more carefully. A fair is larger than the little gathering that formed around the pack horse this morning. There might be stalls, animals, craftsmen, traders from places farther away, perhaps entertainers, perhaps foods that do not usually appear in the village. For John, the possibility opens like a door. Alice hears the excitement in his questions and reminds him that hearing of a fair does not mean the family will go. Thomas will have something to say about it. John nods, but the idea has already taken hold. Late in the afternoon, Thomas returns from the manor. He is tired and dusty from the barn, despite the wet beginning to the day. Before he has fully entered the cottage, John asks him about the fair. Thomas looks at Alice. Alice looks at John. Margaret turns away so that nobody sees her smile. Thomas sits down near the hearth. He removes his muddy shoes. Then he takes the new iron hook from where Alice placed it. For several moments he examines the wall rather than answering. The fair, if it is truly to be held, is still some days away. There will be work to consider. There may be purchases worth making, and there are people in the village who would likely travel together for company on the road. Thomas turns the hook slowly in his hand. "We shall see," he says. For John, these are not disappointing words. They are almost a promise. Outside, the clouds drift eastward, leaving behind a broad, clear evening sky, while through the village the rumor of the coming fair begins to travel from doorway to doorway. By the following morning, the fair is no longer merely a rumor. A man returning from a neighboring parish has heard the same news. The date is confirmed. Traders are expected. Livestock will be brought for sale, and several craftsmen have already taken space near the road outside the town. The event is not one of the great fairs that draw merchants from across kingdoms, but to the villagers it is large enough to matter. Thomas hears this near the well. He says little. John, standing beside him with an empty bucket, hears everything. On the walk home, the boy does not ask again whether they will go. This restraint is so unusual that Thomas notices immediately. The morning is clear after the rain. Water still shines in hollows beside the lane, but a soft breeze moves through the trees, and the sky has the pale blue of a day likely to remain dry. At the cottage, Alice is repairing a small linen bag. Thomas sets down the water. "The fair is certain," he says. Alice pulls the thread through the cloth. "So I heard." Thomas sits beside the doorway. Going to a fair is not simply entertainment. It can be useful. The household needs salt before long. A leather strap should be replaced. Alice would like to inspect wool thread if anyone is selling it at a sensible price. There may also be an opportunity to hear news and compare prices before future purchases. Still, every journey consumes time. A day on the road is a day not spent in the fields. Thomas looks toward the weather. If the next few days remain favorable, the household can spare one. John waits outside, pretending to examine a chicken. Thomas calls him in. The boy appears almost instantly. "They will go," Thomas says, "provided the work is kept up and the weather does not turn." John nods solemnly. Then he runs to find Margaret. The promise changes the atmosphere of the entire household. For the next several days, the fair remains somewhere behind every task. John asks questions while carrying water. How many horses will there be? Thomas does not know. Will merchants come from London? Probably not. Will there be musicians? Perhaps. Will there be swords? Thomas tells him that if there are, they are not buying one. Margaret wants to know whether ribbons will be sold. Alice says ribbons are rarely necessary. Margaret observes that many pleasant things are unnecessary. Alice hides a smile. Yet daily life does not stop for anticipation. Thomas continues his work. Alice tends the household. John and Margaret fulfill their duties. The garden must be weeded, fuel gathered, animals watched, meals prepared. And the sun rises and sinks over the village just as it has done for generations. On the evening before the fair, Alice lays out the clothing the family will wear. Nobody possesses a wardrobe reserved especially for travel. They will wear their better everyday garments, brushed and checked for obvious damage. Thomas has a woolen tunic in respectable condition. Alice selects a clean linen covering for her hair. Margaret carefully smooths the dress she favors. John discovers a tear near the lower edge of his tunic. Alice looks at it, then at him. He explains that it must have happened while carrying wood. Margaret says it happened while climbing a tree. John protests. Alice holds out her hand for the garment. The new needle purchased by Edith is not needed. Alice has one of her own, carefully kept, and she repairs the tear by firelight. Before sunrise the next morning, the cottage is already awake. They eat early. Bread is wrapped for the road, along with a little cheese. Thomas carries a small amount of coin in a pouch concealed safely beneath his clothing. Alice has another smaller purse. They will not travel alone. Several neighbors gather near the church, among them Edith, who has decided that one new needle is clearly insufficient preparation for the future. William comes with his eldest daughter. Another household sends 2 men hoping to inspect livestock. The group sets out while morning mist still hangs over the fields. At first, the road is familiar. They pass Thomas's strips and the meadow beyond. Then the village disappears behind a fold in the land. John turns to look back. The church tower remains visible for some time. After that, even it is gone. The sensation is strange. Home has not vanished, of course, yet for the first time in many weeks, John is walking toward a place beyond the small boundaries of his daily world. The road is uneven but passable. Rain has softened some sections, forcing the travelers around broad, muddy patches. Hedgerows border portions of the way. Elsewhere, the country opens into fields and pasture. They pass another village. Its church looks different. Its houses are arranged along a wider green. To John, even these small differences are fascinating. A woman carrying a basket watches the travelers pass. A blacksmith's hammer rings from somewhere behind a house. For a few moments, John smells hot iron and charcoal. Then the road carries them onward. Traffic gradually increases. 2 men overtake them leading pack horses. A cart follows, loaded with wooden vessels. Later, they meet a flock of sheep being driven in the opposite direction, filling the road with wool, dust, and confusion. The travelers stand aside. One sheep decides that the hedge is more interesting than the road. The shepherd disagrees. For several minutes, progress stops entirely. Nobody appears surprised. Travel by road demands patience. By mid-morning, the landscape changes again. A cluster of roofs becomes visible ahead, then a church tower, then another. The town is larger than John imagined. Not enormous by the standards of England's important cities, but crowded enough to seem extraordinary to someone accustomed to a few dozen households. The road narrows between buildings. Timber-framed upper stories lean outward above ground floors, where workshops and shops open toward the street. Signs hang over several doors, useful in a world where many customers cannot read. The smell strikes first. Smoke, bread, animals, wet leather, dung, cooking onions, ale, fish, people. Dozens of voices overlap. A cartwheel strikes a stone. Somebody shouts for room. A dog barks at another dog. Church bells ring somewhere above it all. John slows down. Thomas places a hand on his shoulder and guides him forward. The fair lies beyond the busiest street on open ground near the edge of town. And as they approach, the quiet world of the village seems to fall away completely. Rows of temporary stalls stand beneath cloth coverings and simple wooden frames. Horses are tethered along one side. Sheep crowd behind hurdles. Chickens complain from baskets. Potters have arranged bowls and jugs in careful rows. Metal workers display tools whose polished edges catch the morning sun. There are cloth sellers, too. Margaret sees those immediately. Dyed wool in red, blue, green, and yellow hangs in folds that appear astonishingly bright after the muted colors of fields and cottages. Alice sees it at the same moment. She says nothing about ribbons being unnecessary. Farther on, a spice seller has opened small containers whose scents drift strangely through the familiar smells of livestock and smoke. Pepper is costly. Other spices are more expensive still. Thomas has no intention of buying them, but he pauses long enough to look. These tiny substances have traveled farther than anyone in his household ever has. Their presence here is evidence of trading networks stretching from English roads to continental ports and, through many intermediaries, toward lands Thomas knows mostly through sermons, travelers' stories, and imagination. John stares at everything. He wants to move in 5 directions at once. Thomas keeps him close. Crowds are useful places for losing both children and purses. They pass a seller of wooden bowls, a shoemaker, a woman offering small cakes, a man with combs carved from bone and horn. At another stall hang bells, buckles, hooks, hinges, and knives. John recognizes a knife much like the one the traveling trader showed him. He does not ask for it. Thomas notices this too. Instead, the family begins with what they actually came to buy: salt. Alice examines the measure carefully. Thomas asks the price. The seller names it. Thomas raises an eyebrow. The negotiation begins quietly. Around them, hundreds of other small negotiations unfold. A woman tests the weight of a pot. A farmer examines a sheep's teeth. Two men argue cheerfully over the value of a leather belt. A child begs for a sweetened cake and is ignored with great consistency. Money passes from hand to hand. Promises are made. Credit is discussed. Goods are inspected, rejected, praised, and criticized. The fair is commerce, but it is also conversation. People who spend much of the year scattered across villages and estates now stand within a few yards of one another. News moves almost as quickly as coin. Thomas hears that grain prices have changed in another town. Alice learns that a familiar family has married a daughter into a parish several miles away. Edith discovers 3 separate versions of a scandal involving a miller and concludes that all of them are probably wrong. John hears music. It comes from beyond the livestock pens. A pipe at first, then a small drum. He turns toward the sound. A circle of people has gathered. At its center, 2 performers are beginning a tune while a third prepares some sort of comic display. John looks at Thomas. Thomas looks at the salt now safely wrapped and placed in Alice's basket. Then he looks toward the crowd. There is no field waiting here for another hour. No barn roof to inspect. No fence leaning in the rain. For once, time can be spent on something that produces nothing except enjoyment. Thomas nods. Together they move toward the music, carrying their purchases with them as the fair hums and brightens beneath the late morning sun. The music is simple, but the crowd receives it warmly. The pipe carries a bright, wandering melody over the fairground, while the small drum keeps a steady beat beneath it. Children edge closer. Adults stand behind them, some smiling openly, others pretending they have stopped only because the path is blocked. John slips into a place where he can see. The third performer wears a patched hood with small pieces of colored cloth sewn along the edge. He bows extravagantly, nearly loses his balance, recovers, and then behaves as though the mistake had been planned. The children laugh. Even Thomas does. For several minutes, the performer juggles 3 wooden balls. Then he exchanges them for small cups and makes a pebble seem to vanish from beneath one and appear beneath another. John watches with complete concentration. He knows there must be a trick. That only makes it more interesting. Around them, the fair continues without pause. Sheep call from their pens. Sellers advertise their goods. Somewhere behind the crowd, a hammer rings against metal. The mingled smells of cooked food, trampled grass, horses, smoke, and wool drift through the warm air. Margaret has moved closer to Alice. She whispers something. Alice looks toward the cloth stalls. Thomas notices. "I thought ribbons were unnecessary," he says. Alice gives him a calm look. "They are." Margaret waits. Alice continues. "But thread is useful." This distinction satisfies everyone except Thomas, who suspects he has lost an argument that was never openly begun. When the performance ends, a cap is passed around. Some people drop in coins. Others offer nothing. Thomas contributes a very small coin, enough to acknowledge the entertainment without disturbing the careful contents of his purse. The musicians begin again as the family moves away. Now they turn toward the cloth sellers. The colors appear even richer at close range. Some fabrics are ordinary wool, dyed in shades that depend upon available materials, skill, repeated processing, and cost. Others are finer and far beyond what Thomas intends to purchase. Medieval clothing is not uniformly brown or gray. People enjoy color when they can afford it, and dyes may produce a surprising range of reds, blues, greens, yellows, and more muted shades. Alice runs a length of wool between her fingers. She tests the weave. The seller watches her closely. She asks a price. Too high. She moves to another piece. Margaret discovers a narrow strip of blue ribbon. She touches it once and then removes her hand. Alice sees. The ribbon is not needed. That remains true. Yet a fair is not merely a place for absolute necessity. After bargaining over thread, Alice buys a small quantity suitable for future mending. Then, after a silence long enough to make Margaret believe the matter is finished, she adds the narrow blue ribbon. Margaret's face changes completely. She says thank you very quietly. Alice places the ribbon in the basket. Thomas looks away toward the livestock as though he has seen nothing. John has now found something even more interesting. A row of horses stands beyond the next group of stalls. Some are sturdy animals suited to carts and agricultural work. Others are smaller riding horses. One, belonging perhaps to a prosperous traveler, has a carefully maintained saddle and a coat so dark it seems almost black in the sunlight. John moves closer. Thomas catches the back of his tunic before he reaches the animal's hindquarters. "Horses kick," he says. John shifts to a safer position. A man nearby is examining the legs of another horse, while its owner speaks rapidly about its excellent qualities. Thomas listens for a moment. Every animal for sale at a fair is, according to its seller, unusually healthy, strong, obedient, and worth considerably more than anyone is willing to offer. This principle appears to be timeless. They continue toward the livestock pens. Here the fair is louder. Pigs push against wooden barriers. Sheep stand packed together in pale, shifting groups. Cattle flick their tails at flies. Buyers inspect bodies, teeth, hooves, wool, and condition with practical attention. For farming people, livestock represents food, labor, manure, wool, hides, reproduction, and wealth that can walk away if a gate is left open. Thomas recognizes a man from a neighboring village and stops to speak. The conversation turns immediately to animals, then weather, then grain. John listens for a while before becoming distracted by the smell of something sweet. Not truly sweet by modern standards, perhaps, but sweeter than the ordinary food of home. A woman is selling small cakes made with flour and a little honey. John looks toward them, then at Thomas. Thomas pretends not to notice. John looks at Alice. Alice is more difficult to deceive. She asks the price. The cakes are small. After a brief discussion, one is purchased and divided among the family. John receives only a piece. He eats it slowly. The honey is faint, but unmistakable. Margaret closes her eyes while chewing hers, trying to make it last. Thomas finishes his in 2 bites. Alice tells him that he has missed the purpose entirely. By early afternoon, the fair has reached its busiest point. The sun is high, and shade beneath awnings has become valuable. Dust rises where the ground has dried. Voices blend into a constant murmur. The family finds a quieter place near a wall and eats the bread and cheese carried from home. Their fairground meal is not much different from a meal in the fields, yet everything around it is different. John watches strangers pass. A friar moves through the crowd. 2 well-dressed townsmen walk together discussing business. A woman carries a basket filled with green herbs. A servant hurries past with a message. Near the road stands a pilgrim with a staff and a worn cloak, speaking to another traveler. The medieval world gathers here in miniature. Village and town meet. Rich and poor cross the same ground. Goods from nearby farms stand beside objects whose materials have traveled great distances. News from 20 miles away may sit beside a story carried across the sea. Thomas tears another piece of bread. He looks around. For a man whose life is rooted in one village, the fair is a reminder that England is larger, busier and more connected than any single field can suggest. John seems to feel this even more strongly. He asks where the road beyond the town goes. Thomas tells him that one branch leads toward a larger market center. And after that, more roads. And after those, Thomas considers. Eventually, if one chose the right roads, ports could be reached. From ports, ships cross the sea. John looks toward the crowded entrance of the fair as though the channel itself might be visible beyond it. Margaret asks whether he intends to walk to France before supper. John ignores her. After eating, they make one final circuit of the stalls. Thomas buys the leather strap he needs. Alice finds no wool worth the price she is willing to pay. Edith, encountered unexpectedly near the pottery, has acquired 2 more needles despite beginning the day with no intention of doing so. She insists they were exceptionally cheap. No one challenges her. Then Thomas stops at a metalworker's stall. John recognizes the knives immediately. Several lie on a board. Some are plain household tools. Others have better handles and finer workmanship. The boy stands beside his father without speaking. Thomas asks to see one of the smallest. The seller hands it over. Thomas tests the handle, studies the blade, and asks the price. John's eyes widen. Thomas bargains. The seller refuses. Thomas begins to put the knife down. The seller changes his mind slightly. A second negotiation follows. At last, Thomas pays. He turns to John. "The knife is not a toy," he explains. "It is for work. It will need care. It will not be thrown, waved about, or taken into games with the other boys." John nods so quickly that Margaret nearly laughs. Thomas places the knife into his son's hands. It is smaller than the one John admired when the traveling trader came through the village. To him, it is far better. He closes his fingers carefully around the wooden handle. For the first time all day, he has no question to ask. The fair continues around him, loud and colorful beneath the afternoon sky. But for several quiet moments, John sees almost nothing except the simple tool resting in his palm. John turns the knife over once, carefully, feeling the smooth wooden handle beneath his thumb. Then Thomas holds out his hand. The boy hesitates only a moment before returning it. "You may carry it when we leave," Thomas says. For now, with crowds pressing around them and animals shifting unpredictably nearby, Thomas slips the knife safely into his own pouch. John accepts this without complaint. The gift has already changed the day. He walks a little taller as they make their way toward the edge of the fair. Around them, afternoon light has begun to soften. The brightest hours are passing, and some traders are already rearranging their goods. Those who expect to remain until evening prepare for another stretch of bargaining. Others, especially people who have traveled only a short distance, begin thinking about the road home. Alice checks the basket. Salt, thread, the narrow blue ribbon, a few smaller necessities. Thomas has his leather strap and the iron hook purchased earlier in the week waiting back at the cottage. Nothing they carry is extravagant. Yet every object has been considered carefully. Medieval households do not simply accumulate possessions without thought. Storage space is limited. Money is valuable. And most useful things demand labor either to make or to purchase. A new bowl, strap, knife, or length of cloth joins the household because someone expects it to work for years. Margaret touches the basket where her ribbon lies hidden beneath other goods. She has said almost nothing about it since Alice bought it. That silence is not lack of excitement. Quite the opposite. She is already imagining when she might wear it. Perhaps on a Sunday. Perhaps on a feast day. Perhaps simply once at home before anyone sees. Near the fairground gate, the family meets William and his daughter. William has purchased a small tool and appears satisfied with himself. Edith stands nearby holding a wrapped pottery cup that nobody remembers her intending to buy. The villagers gather gradually. One man has been delayed by livestock negotiations. Another has learned so much news that he seems determined to repeat all of it before they have taken 10 steps. Thomas waits until everyone is ready. Traveling together is sensible, particularly when carrying purchases and coin. Medieval roads are not filled at every moment with robbers, as later stories sometimes suggest, but journeys still carry risks. Poor weather, injury, damaged bridges, troublesome strangers, lost animals, and simple misdirection can all turn a modest journey into a difficult one. Company is useful. The group leaves the town. John looks back. From the road, the fair becomes a field of awnings and moving figures. The music is still faintly audible. Smoke rises above the cooking fires. Church towers stand beyond the roofs. Then a bend hides most of it. The road home feels shorter. This may be because it is familiar now, or perhaps because everyone has something to discuss. Margaret walks beside William's daughter, speaking quietly about the cloth stalls. Alice and Edith compare prices. Thomas talks with the other men about animals they saw for sale and whether any were truly worth what the sellers asked. John walks between these conversations. At first, he keeps touching the place where he knows the knife will eventually be returned to him. After some time, Thomas notices. He takes it from his pouch. The boy receives it with both hands. Thomas shows him how to carry it safely. The blade remains covered. The tool stays close to the body. There is no flourishing it in the air. John listens with solemn attention. A knife is among the most ordinary tools in medieval life. It cuts food. It trims cord. It shapes wood. It assists in repairs and agricultural tasks. To own one is not to become a warrior from a tale. It is to become slightly more responsible for one's own work. John seems to understand this, at least for the moment. The afternoon cools. Cloud shadows travel across the fields. When the group reaches the place where sheep blocked the road earlier, only a few hoof marks remain in the mud. A skylark rises suddenly from the grass. Its song follows them for several minutes. Then, near the stream, they encounter difficulty. The water is not dangerously high, but yesterday's rain has softened the bank. A narrow crossing that was easy in the morning is now slippery where several carts have passed. Thomas goes first. He tests the ground. William follows. The women and children wait. Nobody is alarmed. It is simply one of those small inconveniences that a road provides. A plank has shifted near the edge. The men move it back into a better position. One by one, the travelers cross. Edith complains that the road ought to be repaired. William says she should tell the king. Edith says the king is unlikely to listen. This produces enough laughter to carry them onward. Beyond the stream, the country becomes increasingly familiar. John begins recognizing trees, then a field boundary, then the distant slope beyond which their village lies. The sun is low when the church tower finally appears. For the first time that day, John looks relieved. Adventure has its pleasures. So does recognition. Smoke rises above the cottages. Someone has already brought cattle in. Children are still playing near the lane. A dog sees the returning group and races toward them, barking as though they have been absent for months. The travelers separate near the churchyard. Good evenings are exchanged. Purchases are carried home. News immediately begins flowing outward toward those who did not attend the fair. Alice reaches the cottage door first. The interior is cool. The hearth is almost dead. She kneels to revive it. Thomas checks the animals. Margaret unwraps the basket. John stands outside in the last sunlight. He draws the knife carefully. The blade catches a narrow strip of gold. He looks for something useful to do. A small piece of hazel lies near the fence. He picks it up. Thomas returns just in time to see him. For a moment, neither speaks. Then Thomas sits on the low stool beside the wall. He holds out his hand. John gives him the hazel and the knife. Thomas shows him how to cut away from his body. Slowly. with control. The blade makes a pale line through the bark. John watches. Thomas returns both objects. The boy tries. His first cut is clumsy. The second is better. By the fifth, a thin shaving curls away from the stick and falls into the grass. John smiles. The fair, the music, the livestock, the colored cloth, the cakes, the crowded streets, all of it seems to gather into this one quiet moment outside the cottage. He has gone farther from home than usual. He has seen more people than he can count. And he has returned with a tool he must learn to use. Inside, Alice has the fire burning again. The smell of warm pottage begins to drift through the doorway. Margaret finally takes out her ribbon. In the firelight, the blue appears deeper than it did beneath the fairground sun. Alice helps her tie it neatly. Margaret touches it once. Thomas enters and looks at his daughter. He says nothing. She looks away, pleased. John follows a few minutes later, carrying the hazel stick. One end is now roughly shaped. He places the knife beside his father before supper without being asked. Thomas notices. This matters more than the quality of the carving. The family eats. Conversation is livelier than usual. Each person remembers a different part of the day. Margaret speaks about the cloth. Alice mentions prices. Thomas talks about a horse he would never have bought. John describes the juggler, though everyone saw the same performance. Outside, darkness gathers over the road they traveled. The town and fair now lie beyond the hills, still busy perhaps, still bright with firelight and voices. But here, the village has become quiet again. The familiar church bell sounds. John turns his head toward it. This morning the bell marked departure. Tonight it marks return. And as the family settles around the hearth, the wider medieval world seems both larger than before and strangely closer to home. The next morning comes quietly. John wakes before anyone calls him. For several moments he lies beneath the woolen covering, listening to the soft sounds of the cottage. Alice is already moving near the hearth. Thomas coughs once in his sleep. Outside, a bird begins a thin, uncertain song from the roof. John remembers the knife. He sits up. It is where Thomas placed it the night before, safely out of reach of the youngest child. The sight of it brings back the fair in a rush of color and noise. Then Alice tells him to fetch water. The knife will have to wait. This is another lesson the medieval day teaches without ever announcing it. Even the most exciting possession quickly becomes part of ordinary life. John carries the bucket toward the well. The village seems unusually small after yesterday's town. The lane contains no crowded stalls. No musicians play beside the churchyard. Only a few hens wander through the mud, and Edith is standing outside her cottage shaking crumbs from a cloth. Yet John notices things he did not notice before. The familiar blacksmith's work seems more interesting now that he has seen rows of metal goods at the fair. The cart near William's house looks different after he has watched traders moving merchandise along the road. Even the church tower appears to belong to a larger network of roads, parishes, towns, and travelers. Perhaps journeys change home by changing the person who returns to it. At the well, John draws water carefully. The rope is rough against his hands. A girl from another household waits behind him with 2 vessels. She asks whether the fare was good. John says yes. Then, trying to sound older than he feels, he adds that prices were high. The girl nods gravely. This is something adults say often enough to be useful in almost any market conversation. John carries the water home. Thomas is awake now. After breakfast, he returns the knife to his son. There is work to be done near the hedge where several useful branches need trimming. John immediately understands that this is not an accident. Thomas intends to teach him. They walk together to the edge of the field. The morning air is cool, and thin clouds soften the sun. Thomas chooses a small branch. He shows John where to place his thumb, how to keep the blade moving away from his hand, how to make a shallow cut rather than forcing the knife deeply into wood. John tries. The first shaving is thick, the second breaks, the third curls neatly. Thomas says nothing, but the corner of his mouth lifts. They spend perhaps half an hour there. No song commemorates it. No clerk records it. Yet this kind of teaching is among the strongest threads connecting medieval generations. Skills pass from hand to hand. A child watches how a parent sharpens a tool, repairs a roof, judges grain, chooses timber, treats cloth, prepares food, recognizes weather, or handles an animal. Much of practical knowledge is learned by observation long before it is explained. John finishes smoothing the branch. It is not beautiful. It is useful enough. He carries it home. Alice has already begun another task. A quantity of wool has been brought out for sorting. Margaret works beside her. The blue ribbon from the fair is nowhere visible. Alice has stored it safely. It will not be worn every day. That is partly what makes it special. The wool requires patience. Before fibers can become cloth, they must pass through many stages. Sheep are shorn. Fleeces are cleaned and sorted. Wool may be combed or carded depending on the desired preparation and period practice. Then comes spinning, perhaps dyeing, weaving, fulling, finishing, cutting, and sewing. A finished tunic hides an extraordinary amount of labor. Margaret understands this more clearly with every year. She lifts a section of wool and removes bits of unwanted material. Alice corrects the way she is separating the fibers. Margaret tries again. John watches briefly from the doorway. Textile work does not interest him today. He has a knife. Alice looks up. Not indoors. John stops. He was not actually cutting anything yet, but he decides not to test the argument. Outside, Thomas is fitting the iron hook purchased from the traveling trader. The hook is meant for the area near the hearth, but the wall needs a small piece of wood adjusted first. John kneels nearby. Thomas allows him to trim one edge. Slowly, the knife enters practical service. When the hook is finally fixed into place, Alice tests it. A pot can now be managed more conveniently. She gives Thomas an approving nod. Then she looks at John. And the knife helped? John says yes before his father can answer. Alice smiles. The object that seemed like treasure at the fair has already helped improve something at home. By midday, the village has settled fully back into routine. The fair is still discussed, but less urgently. A new rumor has begun circulating that the coming weeks may bring a visit from an estate official. Nobody knows exactly when. This news interests Thomas more than John. Such visits may involve accounts, rents, inspections, or other business depending on local arrangements. For villagers, authority often arrives not in the form of a king on horseback, but through clerks, stewards, reeves, bailiffs, courts, and documents. Many rural people may never see their king. They certainly understand lordship. Thomas hears the rumor near the barn and stores it away with other useful information. There is no immediate reason for concern. The afternoon becomes warmer. John joins his father in the field. Margaret comes later carrying food. They eat beneath the same tree where they rested before the fair. This time, John has the knife at his belt. Margaret notices. She says it makes him look important. John believes this is mockery. It is. Thomas breaks the bread. The conversation turns toward Sunday. Work patterns will change. The parish church will gather much of the village. Religious observance, rest from certain forms of labor, social contact, and household necessities will shape the day differently from an ordinary working morning. John asks whether he may wear the knife. Thomas says yes if he behaves sensibly. Margaret asks whether she may wear the blue ribbon. Alice is not there to answer. Thomas looks alarmed by the possibility that the decision might fall to him. He says she should ask her mother. Margaret accepts this tactical retreat. The afternoon work continues. Clouds build in the west, but produce no rain. When Thomas finally straightens, the sun is already moving lower. They walk home together. At the village edge, a group of children has gathered around something beside the lane. John approaches. A hedgehog has appeared from beneath a pile of brush. The children surround it at a respectful distance. The animal, perhaps unimpressed by all of medieval humanity, has curled itself tightly into a prickled ball. Nobody knows what to do with it. Thomas tells them to leave it alone. This is disappointing advice. It is also followed. As the children scatter, the hedgehog eventually uncurls and disappears beneath the hedge. John watches until the last movement of leaves stops. Then he turns toward home. The evening is gentler than the one after the fair. There is no great excitement to discuss. Alice cooks. Margaret spins for a while. Thomas checks the fence. John works on the hazel stick with his knife. Slowly, a shape begins to emerge. He does not yet know what it will become. Perhaps a peg, perhaps a handle, perhaps nothing useful at all. That does not matter. Near sunset, the bells begin to sound. Across the village, people stop and listen as they have listened countless times before. John rests the knife on his knee. Only yesterday, his mind was filled with roads leading outward. Tonight, sitting beneath the thatched eaves, he notices another kind of journey. His father once learned to hold a blade. Alice once learned to judge dough beneath her palms. Margaret is learning the patient work of wool and thread. Every ordinary skill carries a past within it. The knowledge of people whose names were never written down survives for a little while in the movements of those who come after them. John cannot know this. He only knows that the blade cuts better when he does not hurry. So he lowers his eyes to the hazel wood again, and beneath the long evening light, he tries another careful stroke. The shaving falls lightly into the grass. John turns the hazel stick and studies the pale surface beneath the bark. His cuts are still uneven, but the movement of his hand has already changed since morning. He is beginning to understand that a useful blade rewards patience more than strength. From inside the cottage, Alice calls him. The evening meal is ready. John closes the knife carefully and slips it away. The unfinished stick remains beneath the eaves, where he can find it tomorrow. Inside, the family gathers once more around the hearth. The room is warm now. A little steam rises from the pot, and the smell of onions and herbs hangs beneath the rafters. Margaret has finished spinning for the evening. Thomas sits with his hands resting on his knees, the posture of a man whose body knows the day is ending before his mind has quite accepted it. They eat without hurry. Sunday is mentioned again. Alice has decided that Margaret may wear the blue ribbon. Not all day, she says. Margaret agrees at once. John asks whether there will be work after church. There will always be some work, Alice tells him. Animals do not recognize holy days, and fires do not maintain themselves. Yet the rhythm will be different. Sunday morning arrives beneath a clear sky. The village wakes a little later than on an ordinary working day, though not late by modern standards. Animals still need feeding. Water must still be drawn. Breakfast must still be prepared. But there is less movement toward the distant fields. Instead, people turn gradually toward the church. Alice helps Margaret arrange the blue ribbon. It is narrow and simple. Against her better dress, however, it seems almost luminous. Margaret pretends not to care too much. John wears his knife carefully. Thomas checks that it is secured properly. Then the family steps into the lane. The church bell is already calling. Villagers emerge from doorways in clothing brushed cleaner than on working mornings. Faces that Thomas normally sees bent over fields or half hidden in barns are gathered now in one place. Sunday is worship, but it is also community. People notice who has arrived. Who is absent? Who has new shoes? Who appears tired? Who has brought a visiting relative? Who seems unusually cheerful? Edith sees Margaret's ribbon almost immediately. She approves. This surprises Alice. The churchyard is bright with morning light. Grass grows between the graves. Some memorials are marked more substantially than others. Many ordinary burials leave little that will survive for centuries. Generations of villagers lie close to the building where the living now gather. Inside, the change in atmosphere is immediate. The stone walls hold coolness even on a mild day. Small windows admit narrow pools of light. Depending on the wealth and history of the parish, there may be painted decoration, carved figures, wall imagery, or colored glass. Medieval churches are often far more visually rich than the bare stone interiors left by later centuries might suggest. The air smells faintly of wax, stone, wool, and people. Thomas removes his cap. The family takes its accustomed place. The service unfolds within the Latin liturgy of the medieval Western Church, though much of the congregation does not understand Latin as a spoken language. That does not mean the ritual is meaningless to them. Familiar gestures, bells, images, sermons or instruction in the vernacular, repeated prayers, the church calendar, and the accumulated habits of a lifetime make the experience recognizable. John watches the priest. He has seen this many times. Still, his attention wanders. A shaft of sunlight has reached one wall. Dust drifts slowly through it. Somewhere behind him, a child shifts impatiently. An elderly man coughs. The little sounds of ordinary human life continue beneath sacred ritual. For medieval villagers, heaven and earth are not neatly separated categories. Religion shapes how many understand sickness, harvest, marriage, death, obligation, charity, fortune, and time itself. The year is full of holy days. The saints have feast days. Certain foods are avoided during fasts. Processions may move through fields. Church bells mark both celebration and danger. And the parish is one of the strongest institutions binding local life together. When the service ends, nobody immediately rushes home. People gather outside. This may be the most socially active hour of the week. Thomas speaks with William. Alice joins several women near the church wall. Margaret stands with girls of similar age. John finds the boys from his afternoon game. For a while, the churchyard becomes a place of conversation. The estate official is discussed again. The rumor is now firmer. He may arrive within the week. Another man has heard that repairs are needed at a bridge farther down the road. Someone asks about the fair. Someone else has already heard a distorted story about a performer who supposedly juggled 6 knives while standing on a horse. John knows perfectly well that the man juggled 3 wooden balls while standing firmly on the ground. He briefly considers correcting the story. Then he decides the improved version is more entertaining. Near the wall, Edith is telling Alice that her new needles were an excellent investment. Alice asks how many needles one household reasonably needs. Edith says more than Alice thinks. Neither woman intends to change her opinion. The sun rises higher. Eventually, families begin drifting away. Some return home for food. Others remain nearby. A few men discuss village matters at greater length. Children begin games wherever adults are least likely to interfere. John and the boys take out their rough ball. Thomas sees the knife at his belt. He points to it. John understands. Before joining the game, he carries the knife home and leaves it safely with Alice. This small act earns him more trust than he realizes. The game begins. It has no carefully marked field. Boundaries are defined by a ditch, a fence, 2 trees, and whatever everyone agreed upon a moment ago. The ball is kicked. Everyone runs. Within seconds, the original rules become uncertain. A boy claims a point. Another says there was no point. A third says the ball went out. Nobody knows where out actually is. John forgets the fair, the trader, the estate official, and everything else. He runs until he is breathless. Nearby, Thomas and William sit in the shade. They watch without much concern. The village looks different on Sunday. Fields that normally draw people outward are quieter. The lane has fewer carts. There is time to speak longer than usual. Thomas asks William whether he remembers a particularly wet summer from years before. William does. They compare memories of harvests. This is how much local knowledge is stored. Not in written records, though manorial clerks may preserve accounts and court rolls, but in remembered weather, family stories, boundaries, disputes, marriages, illnesses, and seasons. An old man remembers where a fence stood before either Thomas or William was born. A widow knows which household once held a particular strip. A shepherd knows where water remains longest after heavy rain. A child learns these things gradually, without ever being given a formal lesson called history. The village carries its own past. By early afternoon, Alice calls the family home. The meal is better than on many working days. There is bread, cheese, vegetables, and a small portion of meat saved for the occasion. Meat is not absent from peasant diets, but its amount and frequency vary with wealth, season, custom, access, and circumstance. A Sunday meal may justify something a little more special. John arrives red-faced from running. Margaret tells him he has grass on his tunic. John says the ribbon is crooked. It is not. Margaret adjusts it anyway. They eat. Afterward, the cottage becomes unusually quiet. Thomas rests. Alice sits near the doorway with her hands still for once. Margaret turns the ribbon between her fingers. John lies outside in the grass. Clouds move slowly overhead. There is work that could be done. There is always work that could be done. But for an hour, very little is. A bee moves through the clover. Somewhere beyond the houses, sheep call. The church tower casts a short shadow over the yard. John closes his eyes. The road to the fair seems far away now. So does tomorrow. For this small stretch of afternoon, medieval time feels broad and unhurried. Then the bell sounds again. John opens his eyes. The note moves across the rooftops and into the fields. Sunday is passing. Evening will come. Tomorrow the ordinary working week will begin again. But before it does, the village has been given these few slower hours, and beneath the mild English sky, people spend them in the ancient luxury of having nowhere else they must immediately be. The bell fades, and the village slowly resumes its evening shape. Thomas remains seated for a little while beneath the shade, watching the light change across the yard. Sunday has not removed responsibility, it has only softened its edges. Soon he rises to check the animals, while Alice returns to the cottage and begins preparing what will be needed for the next morning. John does not immediately move. He lies on his back in the grass and watches a swallow pass high above the roof. Then another. The birds turn sharply in the evening air, quick and effortless against the pale sky. For a moment he imagines following them beyond the village, beyond the market town, beyond the ports Thomas mentioned, perhaps even across the sea. It is not a plan. It is only the sort of thought that appears when a boy has recently discovered that every road continues farther than he expected. Margaret steps over him. "You will be trampled by a cow one day," she says. John sits up. "There are no cows here." "There could be." She continues toward the doorway. John follows. Inside, Alice has removed Margaret's ribbon and folded it carefully. The bright blue strip disappears into a small chest with the few objects the household chooses to protect from everyday wear. Tomorrow, ordinary clothing will return. So will ordinary work. The next morning proves that point quickly. Before sunrise, Thomas is awake. The air is colder. A thin mist lies near the ground, and the grass is wet enough to darken his shoes almost at once. He and John eat early and leave for the fields. This time there is no fare ahead of them, no promised entertainment, no new knife waiting at the end of the road, only work. And in some ways, this is closer to the true rhythm of medieval life than anything exceptional could be. The days repeat, but never exactly. One morning brings rain, another brings wind, a third brings news, a fourth brings nothing unexpected at all. Thomas and John reach the strip as the eastern sky brightens. The crop stands quietly beneath the dew. Thomas examines several plants. He notices damage near one edge, not much, enough to require attention. John crouches beside him. Together they look for the cause. Perhaps birds, perhaps small animals, perhaps a simple weakness in the growth. Farming rarely offers perfect certainty. You observe, you remember, you act as best you can. Then you wait. The work occupies most of the morning. They remove weeds, improve the edge of a drainage run, and repair a small section where trampling has disturbed the soil. John uses his knife once to cut cord. This pleases him more than it should. The knife is already becoming scratched. That also pleases him. A tool that remains perfect has not been useful. Near midday, clouds gather. Thomas looks west. He does not like them. The air has become heavy. The breeze has fallen. Across the field, other workers pause to examine the same sky. Weather knowledge is never exact, but people who spend their lives outdoors learn to notice signs that a person indoors might ignore. The smell changes. The light changes. Birds behave differently. Thomas decides not to wait. He and John gather their things and begin walking back. Halfway to the village, the first drop falls, then another. John looks upward. Thomas tells him to keep moving. They reach the churchyard just as the rain begins in earnest. Several villagers hurry toward shelter. A woman lifts her skirt slightly above the mud. A child runs laughing until his mother catches him by the arm. Thomas and John reach home damp but not soaked. Alice has already moved several things away from the doorway. She looks at Thomas. You were right. He says nothing. This is the safest response. The rain settles over the village for the rest of the afternoon. Work changes indoors. Thomas repairs a wooden handle. Alice spins. Margaret helps prepare food. John sharpens a small peg with his knife under careful supervision. The cottage darkens long before evening. Rain on thatch produces a soft, continuous sound. Smoke from the hearth hangs lower than usual before finding its way out. The youngest child sleeps near the fire. For an hour, almost no one speaks. This silence is not discomfort. It is the silence of shared work. Outside, water fills the ruts again. The church tower disappears behind gray rain. The road becomes empty. Later, someone knocks at the door. Thomas rises. William stands outside, wet at the shoulders. He brings firmer news. The estate official will arrive tomorrow. The reeve has been told to have certain people present. Thomas is among them. William, too. The matter appears routine, accounts, questions about holdings, perhaps discussion of labor obligations. Nothing suggests trouble. Yet the news changes the room slightly. Thomas asks what time. Morning. After the first work is done. William leaves. Alice watches Thomas sit down again. Do you owe anything? Thomas shakes his head. Not that he knows of. The household has met what is expected. Still, written accounts possess a kind of authority that memory alone does not. A clerk's line on parchment can matter greatly, especially when custom, rent, or obligation is disputed. Thomas is not afraid, but he is thoughtful. John senses this. He asks whether the king's man is coming. Thomas smiles. No, not the king's man, an official connected to the manor. This answer disappoints John slightly. He had imagined someone in shining clothes arriving on a great horse. The truth will be much less theatrical. The next morning confirms it. The official arrives with 2 other men, one of them a clerk. Their horses are respectable but muddy. Their clothes are better than Thomas's, though not magnificent. They dismount near the manor buildings. The clerk carries writing materials protected carefully from the weather. John watches from the lane. Thomas tells him to go home. John takes 3 steps toward the cottage, then 5. Then he stops behind a fence where he believes he cannot be seen. Thomas sees him. He decides not to say anything. The villagers summoned gather near one of the manor rooms. Inside, the air smells of timber, wool, damp clothing, and ink. The clerk opens a roll. Writing itself holds a special kind of power in medieval administration. Many villagers cannot read the Latin or French that may appear in formal documents, yet they understand that records endure beyond spoken memory. Names, rents, fines, services, transfers of land, court decisions, all can be written. Thomas waits. One man is called before him, a question is asked about a holding, then another about unpaid work. The discussion is calm. The official listens. The reeve answers. The clerk writes. When Thomas's turn comes, the matter is simpler than he feared. A customary payment is confirmed. A small question concerning one strip is clarified. Thomas states what he knows. The reeve agrees. The clerk makes a mark, and that is all. Years of anxiety do not follow. No dramatic judgment falls. History passes through a room and moves on. Thomas steps outside. John is still near the fence. Thomas looks directly at him. John suddenly becomes fascinated by the ground. Thomas walks over. Did you hear everything? John admits that he heard very little. Good. They walk home together. The official's visit will be discussed throughout the village for the rest of the day. Some will remember every detail accurately. Others will improve it. By supper, one version will claim that a man was nearly fined 3 times what was actually discussed. By tomorrow, someone will insist the clerk carried a sword. But for Thomas, the event is already becoming ordinary. He enters the cottage. Alice looks up. Well, it is done, she nods. That is enough. Outside, the rain clouds have broken apart. Late sunlight shines on the wet roofs. John sits beneath the eaves and takes out his knife. The hazel stick is still there. He begins carving again. A small peg, he has decided. Nothing grand, nothing worth carrying to a fair. Nothing a clerk would ever record. Yet, by the time the light fades, the peg fits neatly into the loose place in the fence where Thomas needed one. Thomas tests it. It holds. John smiles. And, as evening settles over the village, one tiny part of the household stands firmer because the boy has learned, almost without noticing, how to make something useful with his own hands. Thomas leaves the peg in place. There is no ceremony. He simply presses the fence once more, finds that it no longer shifts, and gives John a small nod before turning toward the animals. For John, this is enough. The knife at his belt no longer feels like something purchased at a fair. It feels like a tool that belongs to his life. The next several days pass without travelers, officials, or unusual news. This is how most days are. Morning bells, water carried from the well, smoke rising from the hearth, work in fields and gardens, meals that resemble yesterday's meals, weather discussed with seriousness, animals escaping from places they have been carefully placed, clothing repaired, wood cut, children called home. The rhythm continues so steadily that an outsider might think nothing is happening. But ordinary life is full of small changes. The grain grows. Fruit slowly thickens on trees. A hen begins sitting on eggs. The youngest child learns a new word. Margaret becomes faster with the spindle. John's hands become more confident with the knife. Thomas notices a new ache in one knee and says nothing about it. Alice notices anyway. One afternoon, the weather turns warm enough that work slows beneath the sun. The village seems almost sleepy. Thomas and John are repairing part of a boundary near the common when the boy hears bells. Not church bells. Smaller bells, irregular. They come from the road. John stands. A flock of sheep appears beyond the bend, moving toward them in a pale, dusty mass. 2 men and a dog guide the animals. The bells hang from several of the sheep, producing a wandering music as the flock approaches. Thomas moves aside. John does the same. The dog runs behind the animals with intense concentration. For several minutes, the road disappears beneath wool. The smell is strong. Dust rises. One sheep pauses beside John and looks at him with an expression of profound suspicion. John looks back. The shepherd calls. The sheep moves on. When the flock has passed, the road is empty again except for a cloud of dust settling slowly into sunlight. Thomas returns to the fence. John watches the last sheep vanish. He has begun noticing movement differently since the fair. Every traveler seems connected to somewhere else. Every load carried along the road has an origin and a destination. Even sheep are part of something larger. Their wool may be sold, washed, sorted, spun, perhaps woven nearby, perhaps carried farther. English wool is an important commodity in medieval trade, especially the finer fleeces that enter wider commercial networks. Merchants, landowners, religious houses, towns, ports, and foreign cloth-making centers can all be linked by the quiet business of sheep grazing in English fields. John knows almost none of this in detail. He only knows that sheep provide wool, and that wool becomes cloth. But the road is beginning to teach him that simple things travel. Later that afternoon, he returns home to find Alice and Margaret discussing precisely that subject. A neighbor has brought over a small quantity of particularly good wool and wants Alice's opinion. She lifts the fibers, pulls them gently, examines their softness. The women talk about where the sheep came from, whether the fleece was clean, whether the price being asked is sensible. John listens from the doorway. Yesterday he would have ignored this conversation. Today he thinks of the flock on the road. Margaret notices him listening. "Do you want to learn spinning?" John disappears outside. The answer is clear. Evening comes warm and still. After supper, several villagers remain outdoors longer than usual. The light lasts. Children play near the lane. Adults sit where air moves more freely than inside the cottages. Thomas carries a stool outside. Alice sits beside him. Margaret brings wool. John brings the hazel scraps left from his carving. For once, nobody seems in a hurry to complete anything. Across the village, voices drift between houses. Somebody sings a short line of a familiar song. Someone else joins for a moment. Then the singing stops. A horse stamps in the distance. Bats begin turning above the churchyard. The church tower darkens against a sky that remains pale in the west. John lies on the grass again. The earth still holds the day's warmth. Thomas and Alice speak quietly. Not about kings, not about the official, not even about the fair. They discuss whether the roof needs attention before autumn rains. One section of thatch has begun to look thin. Thomas believes it will last a little longer. Alice does not. This disagreement continues for several minutes without reaching a conclusion. A medieval house is never entirely finished. Its materials age. Thatch decays. Daub cracks. Timber shifts. Weather enters through weaknesses. Maintenance is part of living, not a separate project completed once and forgotten. The cottage has probably been altered before Thomas's family lived in it. It may be altered again after they are gone. Buildings, like tools, survive through repair. Alice eventually wins the argument. The roof will be inspected. Thomas does not admit that she has won. He merely says he will look at it tomorrow. Darkness deepens. One by one, the neighbors disappear indoors. John remains outside until the first stars become visible. He has seen the same sky all his life. Yet tonight, perhaps because the road has occupied his thoughts, he wonders whether the trader sees these same stars from another village. whether the performers from the fair are sleeping in a town farther away, whether the shepherds with their sheep have reached wherever they intended to go. The medieval world can feel small when measured by speed. A person on foot may travel only a modest distance in a day. A cart moves slowly. A horse needs rest. Roads become difficult in bad weather. Yet the world is also threaded together by people who keep moving through it. A story can cross a county. A coin can pass through 100 hands. A piece of wool can leave an English pasture and become cloth far beyond the sight of the shepherd who watched the sheep graze. A pilgrim may return with memories of landscapes his neighbors will never see. And a child in a quiet village may begin to imagine distances long before he ever travels them. Alice calls John inside. He rises. The family settles for sleep. The next morning, Thomas keeps his promise about the roof. After breakfast, he brings out a ladder. John holds it steady. Thomas climbs carefully. From above, the village looks different. The roofs seem lower. The gardens form small patches behind the houses. The lane bends past the church and continues toward fields washed pale by morning. Thomas examines the thatch. Alice was right. One section requires attention sooner than he hoped. He calls down for John to bring him a tool. The boy obeys. Soon, Thomas is working above, while John remains below, passing what is needed. Margaret comes outside. She shades her eyes. Will it fall in? Thomas says no. Alice appears behind her. Not now. Thomas looks down. He decides not to respond. The repair will require fresh material and perhaps help from someone with more experience in thatching. Medieval villagers often depend upon one another's knowledge. Some work can be done within the household. Other tasks are better entrusted to people practiced in them. Thomas climbs down. He wipes his hands. Later, he speaks to William. By afternoon, arrangements are already being made. A neighbor who has repaired several roofs will come the following day. Thomas will help him with another task in return. Nothing is written. No coin necessarily changes hands. The agreement rests on familiarity, memory, and mutual usefulness. This, too, is part of the village economy. Not every exchange appears in an account roll. The next day, the men work on the roof. Bundles of prepared thatching material are carried up. Old sections are examined. Loose areas are tightened and replaced where necessary. John spends much of the morning below, fetching, holding, carrying, and being told to stand somewhere else. He complains only once. By midday, the roof line looks slightly different. Not new, simply cared for. Thomas stands in the yard and studies it. The cottage will never impress a lord. No traveler will stop to admire its architecture. Yet it shelters the family from rain. It holds their fire. It stores their few possessions. It gathers their meals and sleep and arguments and laughter beneath one roof. For them, this small building is the center from which every road begins. That evening, clouds gather again in the west. Thomas looks up at the repaired thatch. Alice follows his gaze. Neither says anything. During the night, rain arrives. It falls steadily for several hours. John wakes once and listens. No water drips where it did before. He hears only the soft rush of rain across the roof. In darkness, he smiles and closes his eyes. Above him, fresh thatch holds against the weather. Beside him, the family sleeps. Beyond the walls, the village lies beneath rain, fields shining invisibly in the night. And another ordinary medieval day passes safely into memory. Morning comes silver after the rain. For a little while, the village seems washed clean. Water hangs from the edges of the thatch. The lane is dark with mud. Leaves shine. A thin veil of mist lies low over the fields, and beyond it the church tower rises as if from a pale sea. Thomas steps outside and looks up at the roof. No damage. No dark wet patch beneath the repaired section. He runs a hand along the wall near the doorway and gives a small, satisfied nod. Inside, Alice has already rekindled the fire. The cottage smells of smoke, damp wool, and yesterday's bread. Margaret is awake but quiet. John is still curled beneath the blanket, though he opens one eye when Thomas returns. The roof held, Thomas says. Alice does not look up from the pot. I thought it would. Thomas smiles. There are victories too small for any chronicle, and this is one of them. Breakfast is eaten. The youngest child objects to his portion for reasons known only to himself, then eats it anyway. John fastens his knife at his belt. Margaret gathers what Alice has asked her to carry. Soon the household divides into the work of the day. Thomas and John will go toward the meadow first. Alice and Margaret remain closer to home. The air outside is cool enough to make breath faintly visible in the lowest ground, though the season is far from winter. Their shoes sink into the softened lane. A cart has already passed. Its wheels have left 2 deep tracks leading toward the manor buildings. Thomas recognizes the cart. It belongs to a household from the neighboring village. Perhaps grain is being delivered. Perhaps someone has business with the reeve. He does not know. He and John turn toward the meadow. Rainwater has collected along one edge. The ditch they cleared earlier is carrying most of it away, but a blockage has formed where leaves, grass, and small branches have gathered against a narrow place. Thomas points. John understands. They set to work. Within minutes, cold, muddy water reaches John's ankles. He grimaces. Thomas keeps working. The obstruction loosens gradually. Then suddenly the water breaks through. It rushes along the shallow channel with unexpected speed, carrying leaves and fragments of grass with it. John steps back too late. Water splashes his legs. Thomas laughs. Not loudly, enough. John looks offended. Then he laughs too. The ditch clears. Another small problem solved. Nothing about the task is dramatic, but medieval agriculture depends on countless acts like this. Fields and meadows need continual attention. Water must be guided. Boundaries maintained. Paths kept usable. Animals watched. Damage noticed early. The landscape does not simply provide. It requires negotiation. Thomas and John remain near the meadow through much of the morning. Clouds break apart. Sunlight warms their backs. By the time the church bell sounds again, the mist has disappeared. They rest beneath a tree. John removes the bread Alice packed. Thomas cuts the cheese. For several minutes, they eat without speaking. Then John asks a question he has been carrying since the fair. "Have you ever seen the sea?" Thomas looks toward him. The answer is no. John seems surprised. Thomas has traveled farther than the boy, but not so far as a port. He has been to larger towns. Once, years ago, he journeyed several days to visit kin after a marriage. He has seen roads busier than the one through their village. He has seen a river wide enough to carry substantial boats, but not the sea. John considers this carefully. "Would you like to?" Thomas tears a piece of bread. "Perhaps. One day." There is no sadness in his answer. The sea is far away, but so are many places. A life need not contain all of them to be complete. John, however, is young enough to believe that every place not yet seen is waiting specifically for him. Thomas does not discourage this. They finish eating. Back in the village, Alice's morning has followed another rhythm. She and Margaret have been working with food stores. The garden provides vegetables in season, but a household must always think ahead. Medieval survival depends heavily on timing. Crops ripen at particular moments. Fruit must be gathered before it spoils. Meat, when available in quantity, cannot be kept fresh indefinitely. Grain must be protected from damp and pests. Dairy products change quickly without refrigeration. Preserving food is part knowledge, part routine. Salting, drying, smoking, fermenting, turning milk into butter or cheese, keeping grain dry, storing certain roots or fruits where they may last. The methods depend on what is available, the household's means, and the season. Alice checks onions stored in a dry place. One has begun to rot. She removes it immediately. Margaret asks whether the rest will be safe. Probably. If they are kept dry, waste begins easily, rot spreads. Mice find openings. Insects appear. A household's stores are never entirely secure. Near midday, a neighbor arrives carrying a small wooden bowl. She has extra curds. Alice has something else she can offer in return. The exchange is casual. Nobody calculates a market price. The two women know that another day the direction may reverse. Such exchanges help strengthen village life. A household may be mostly responsible for its own survival, but no family is truly independent. Neighbors lend tools, share labor, watch children, help with animals, bring food during illness, carry news, remember debts and kindnesses long after either has been mentioned. This closeness can create quarrels as easily as friendship. People living within a small community know one another's habits too well. But it also means that misfortune is rarely invisible. That afternoon, the village is reminded of this. An elderly man named Robert, who lives near the far end of the lane, does not come outside. At first, this means nothing. Then his neighbor knocks. Robert answers, but weakly. Word travels. By late afternoon, the priest has been told. Alice hears from Edith. Thomas hears when he returns from the meadow. Robert is ill. Nobody knows exactly what is wrong. He has a fever and little appetite. Perhaps it is temporary, perhaps not. Illness in the medieval world carries uncertainty that modern medicine has greatly reduced, though not eliminated. Causes are understood through the medical ideas available at the time, including inherited traditions about the balance of bodily humors, alongside practical household remedies, religious belief, experience, and local custom. Professional physicians exist, especially in towns and among those able to afford them. But most ordinary villagers rely first on people nearby. Family, neighbors, local healers, the priest, household knowledge. Rest, warmth, food, herbs, prayers, and observation may be the first responses. Alice prepares a little food that might be easier for Robert to take. Margaret carries it with her. Thomas goes too, partly because Robert lives alone since his wife died some years earlier. John wants to come. Thomas allows it, but tells him to stay outside unless called. They walk down the lane. The cottage is dim. Inside, Robert lies beneath blankets near the hearth. A neighbor has already lit a better fire. The priest sits nearby. There is no panic. Voices remain low. Alice leaves the food. Thomas checks whether anything practical is needed. Water has been brought. Fuel is stacked. Someone will remain nearby for part of the night. Tomorrow another neighbor will come. Robert opens his eyes briefly. He recognizes Thomas. He says he is only tired. Thomas says he believes him. Perhaps he does. Perhaps he simply knows that comfort is more useful than argument. Outside, John waits by the wall. For once, he does not carve anything. He watches people enter and leave. Edith brings a cloth. William brings wood. Another woman carries water. No one has been summoned formally. No official has ordered this. The village has simply begun to gather around one of its own. When Thomas emerges, John walks beside him in silence. The evening sun has broken through the clouds again. It throws long shadows across the wet lane. John glances back at Robert's cottage. Will he be well? Thomas does not answer immediately. I hope so. It is the only answer he can give. They continue home. The church bell sounds as they reach their own doorway. Alice and Margaret arrive shortly after. Supper is quieter than usual. Nobody says that Robert may be seriously ill. Nobody needs to. Afterward, Thomas checks the animals. John sits beneath the repaired roof with his knife in his hands, but does not use it. Across the village, one cottage remains brighter than the others, because the fire inside is being kept high. Every so often, a figure crosses its doorway. Someone carrying water, someone bringing fuel, someone checking whether Robert is awake. The day ends not in fear, but in attention. And beneath the deepening medieval sky, the village does what small communities have done for longer than anyone can remember. It notices who is missing, then it goes to find them. Robert survives the night. The news reaches Thomas before breakfast. William has already been to the cottage at the far end of the lane and found the old man awake, still feverish but able to drink a little. No one calls this recovery. It is simply better than the alternative everyone had quietly imagined. Alice nods when she hears. She places another piece of wood on the fire. Later, she will send broth. For now, morning work cannot wait. The village rises beneath a pale sky streaked with cloud. Rainwater still glimmers in the deepest ruts, but the air has changed. There is a softness in it, a hint that several mild days may follow. Thomas steps outside with John. The boy glances automatically toward Robert's cottage. A thin line of smoke rises from its roof. That is reassuring. Someone is awake there. Someone is tending the fire. Thomas and John walk toward the fields. For much of the morning, their work is repetitive. They move along the cultivated strip, pulling unwanted growth and checking places disturbed by water. John works more steadily than he did a few weeks earlier. He complains less. Thomas notices this without saying so. Near the end of the strip, John finds a broken wooden peg. He takes out his knife. Thomas watches from several yards away. The boy chooses a small piece of suitable wood, trims it slowly, tests it, trims again, and pushes the replacement into place. It is not perfect. It works. Thomas returns to his own task. The lesson has become habit. By midday, the sky clears. The two sit in the grass to eat. A cart passes along the distant road. Neither pays much attention. Only a few days ago, John would have watched until it vanished. Perhaps this is another way the familiar world expands. At first, every road seems full of mystery. Then one begins to understand that most carts are carrying grain, timber, barrels, people, tools, or some other ordinary burden. Mystery does not disappear. It merely learns to live beside routine. After the meal, Thomas sends John back to the village with a message for Alice. John follows the path alone. When he reaches Robert's cottage, the door is open. Edith is outside. She tells him Robert has eaten. A little. John smiles. Inside, someone laughs weakly. Robert himself, perhaps. The sound is enough. John continues home. Alice receives the message and gives him another in return. He is to take a small vessel of broth back to Robert. So John turns around again. Much of medieval communication happens this way. One person carrying words between households. No letters, no written note, no device ringing at the other end. A child remembers 3 sentences and hopes not to lose the important one. John delivers the broth. Robert is awake when he enters. The cottage smells of herbs, smoke, and damp bedding. The old man looks smaller than John remembers. Illness has changed him quickly. Yet his eyes are clear. He sees the knife at John's belt. That new? John nods. He explains about the fair. Robert asks whether he has cut himself yet. John says no. Robert says this means he has either learned sense or has not owned the knife long enough. John is not sure whether this is a joke. Edith laughs. So he decides it is. Robert drinks a little broth. John leaves feeling lighter than when he arrived. Over the next several days, the fever begins to pass. Robert remains weak. Neighbors continue helping, but gradually the constant visits become fewer. He sits outside one afternoon wrapped in a woolen covering despite the warmth. People passing along the lane greet him. Some stop, some do not. His return to the doorway becomes its own quiet announcement. The village has one less absence. Summer deepens. The fields alter almost imperceptibly. Grain that once seemed young now stands taller. The green begins, little by little, to lose some of its softness. Thomas thinks increasingly about harvest. Everyone does. Harvest is not simply another task, it is the great concentration of the agricultural year, the period when weather, labor, timing, and fortune come together. Grain must be cut when ready. It must be gathered before too much rain. Enough hands must be found. Tools must be prepared. The coming weeks will be busier. One evening, Thomas takes out a sickle and examines the blade. John sits beside him. The metal needs attention. Thomas sharpens it slowly. The sound is soft and regular. Alice is nearby checking baskets. Margaret is mending a cloth used for carrying. Preparation begins long before the first stalk is cut. The household does not know exactly how good the harvest will be. Thomas has seen worse. He has seen better. Some sections look strong, others suffered from wet ground. This uncertainty follows every farmer toward the end of summer. You can plant carefully, weed diligently, repair drainage, watch weather, work from dawn until darkness, and still much remains beyond control. Medieval people may understand that uncertainty through religious belief as well as practical experience. Prayers for good weather and a successful harvest belong naturally beside the sharpening of tools. Faith and labor are not alternatives. Both have their place. The evening before the first serious harvesting begins, the village feels unusually expectant. Tools are ready. Meals have been planned to support longer days. People who ordinarily work separate strips will often find themselves closer together in the fields, helping where customary obligations, household need, or neighborly exchange require it. John knows tomorrow will be difficult. He is excited anyway. Before sleep, he checks the knife. Thomas sees him. "You will need your hands more than that." John puts the knife away. Outside, the night is warm. The stars shine through broken cloud. No rain falls. At dawn, the bells sound over a village already awake. Breakfast is eaten quickly. Alice has prepared food that can be carried. Margaret ties back her hair. Even the younger children will have small tasks close to home or near the fields, watched by older family members. Harvest pulls nearly everyone toward it. Thomas leads the way. The sun has barely touched the horizon when they reach the grain. Dew lies heavy on the stalks. For a few moments, nobody begins. Thomas bends and examines the heads. He rubs grain between finger and thumb. Others nearby are doing the same. Judgment formed through experience passes silently from one person to another. Then the first sickle moves. The stalks make a dry whisper as they are cut. Another sickle follows, then another. Soon the field is alive with repeated motion. Cut, gather, bind, move, begin again. Margaret helps with gathering. John carries and arranges. Alice works nearby when household duties permit. The sun climbs. Dew disappears. The smell of cut grain fills the air. It is dusty and warm and faintly sweet. Nobody talks much. Harvest has its own rhythm. Sickle against stalk, footsteps through stubble, bundles placed together, voices calling only when necessary. By mid-morning, backs ache. Hands are scratched. The first stretch of field has visibly changed. Behind the workers lies short stubble and gathered sheaves. Ahead stands the crop still waiting. John looks back. For once, progress can be measured with the eye. He feels proud. Then Thomas tells him there is much more. John looks forward. His pride becomes slightly quieter. At midday, everyone rests. They sit wherever shade can be found. Food tastes better after hours of work. Bread, cheese, onions, ale, or water. No one complains about simplicity. Hunger is seasoning enough. Thomas stretches his legs. Alice rubs one wrist. Margaret has bits of straw caught in her clothing. John lies flat on the ground. Above them, the sky is clear, almost too clear. Thomas studies it. Good weather today, perhaps tomorrow. They need more than that. Harvest depends upon a sequence of days, not one. But for the moment, the field is dry. The grain is ready. and there are enough hands. After the rest, everyone rises again. The work continues into afternoon. John loses all sense of time. There are only rows, bundles, trips across the field. The church bell sounds, but it seems distant from this intense little world of stalks and sun. At one point, John stops and looks toward the village. The thatched roofs are visible beyond the fields. Smoke rises lazily. Robert's cottage is among them. Somewhere within that cluster of houses are the well, the hearth, the repaired roof, the iron hook, the blue ribbon stored away, and the small peg he carved. All the pieces of an ordinary life. Here in the field, another piece is being secured. Food for months ahead. Bread not yet baked. Pottage not yet cooked. Seed perhaps saved for another sowing. The future carried in bundles of grain. Thomas calls him. John turns back. He lifts another sheaf. The sun moves slowly toward the west. And across medieval England, in villages beyond anything John will ever see, countless other hands are doing much the same. The work continues until the light begins to soften. By then, the field has changed almost beyond recognition. Where grain stood tall in the morning, rows of cut stalks now lie bundled across the stubble. The scent of straw hangs warm in the air. Dust clings to faces and hands. Everyone moves more slowly than before. Thomas straightens with difficulty. For several moments he presses a hand against the small of his back and studies what remains. Enough has been done for one day. More will be waiting tomorrow. The villagers begin gathering tools. Sickles are checked. Baskets are lifted. Loose stalks are collected where possible. Nothing about the ending of harvest work is abrupt. It fades gradually, one person stopping, then another, until the field that rang all day with movement settles into evening quiet. John carries one last bundle. His arms feel heavy. He places it with the others and stands looking down at his scratched hands. They are not badly hurt, just marked by work. Margaret walks past him with straw caught in her hair. Neither has enough energy to mock the other. Thomas calls them toward home. The family begins the slow walk back. Behind them, the harvested section glows gold beneath the lowering sun. Ahead, smoke rises from the village. Other families are returning along neighboring paths, their shapes dark against the light. Nobody walks quickly. The church bell sounds. Tonight, its familiar note seems gentler than usual. John hears it and realizes how tired he is. Yesterday, he imagined harvest as something almost festive, a great event when everyone would fill the fields beneath a bright sky. It is that, and it is aching shoulders, dust in the throat, thirst, repetitive work, feet sore from hours of standing. History is often like this. The grand image and the ordinary discomfort exist together. At the cottage, Alice puts food over the fire. Even she moves carefully. The youngest child has spent much of the day under the supervision of an older neighbor, and now possesses far more energy than anyone else in the family. He runs from one side of the room to the other. Thomas watches him. "Tomorrow," he says, "he can harvest the rest." Alice laughs. It is a quiet laugh. The meal is filling. There is pottage made thicker than usual, bread, cheese, and a little ale. Nobody speaks much while eating. John finishes before everyone else and considers asking for more. Alice sees him looking at the pot. She fills his bowl again. Tonight, he has earned it. Darkness comes while they are still at the hearth. The fire illuminates the new iron hook. The repaired roof holds the day's warmth above them. Margaret's blue ribbon remains safely stored away. John's knife lies near his sleeping place. These possessions seem small, yet each now carries a memory. The trader in the lane, the fair, the road, the roof repair, the first peg, the beginning of harvest. A household is partly made from such memories attached to ordinary things. Before bed, Thomas steps outside. John follows. The evening is clear. A faint breeze moves across the fields, carrying the dry scent of cut grain. From somewhere in the village comes a low song. Another voice joins it, perhaps workers celebrating the day, perhaps someone simply singing because the air is mild. Thomas sits on the stool by the wall. John lowers himself beside him. Neither speaks for some time. Above them, the first stars appear. John thinks of the sea again. He still wants to see it. That desire has not disappeared. But something has changed. He no longer imagines that distant places are more real or important than home. The fair was exciting. The road was exciting. The thought of ports and ships remains exciting. Yet the village has its own mysteries. How deep a well must be before cold water appears. How a roof keeps out rain. How a blade becomes sharp. How grain becomes bread. How neighbors know when someone is ill before any message is sent. How a bell can mean mourning, worship, warning, work, or rest depending only on when it sounds. John has lived among these things all his life. He is only beginning to see them. Thomas looks toward the dark fields. "Tomorrow will be harder," he says. John sighs. Thomas smiles. Then he adds that perhaps, if the weather remains good and the work goes well, there will be a harvest gathering afterward. This wakes John slightly. Food? Probably. Music? Perhaps. John considers asking whether there will be cakes. He decides not to appear too hopeful. The next morning begins even earlier. The village is awake in darkness. Small lights move between houses. Fires are rekindled. Food is packed. Tools are lifted. When the people reach the fields, the eastern horizon is only beginning to brighten. Then the sun rises. Harvest resumes. Day follows day. The work becomes the center of everything. More grain is cut. More bundles are gathered. Some are left to dry appropriately before being moved. Weather is watched with constant attention. Clouds are discussed as if they were unreliable neighbors. One afternoon brings a brief shower, and everyone waits impatiently beneath cover. Another day is hot enough that work slows, but the feared long rain does not arrive. Little by little, the standing grain disappears. John becomes stronger. Margaret becomes faster. Alice keeps household and field work moving together with a skill so practiced that much of it is almost invisible. Thomas grows more tired. Yet every evening he looks back at the harvested land with growing relief. Then, one afternoon, the last significant section is cut. There is no trumpet, no proclamation. A sickle passes through the final handful of stalks. The grain falls. For half a heartbeat, nobody reacts. Then someone cheers. A second voice answers. Laughter spreads across the field. Thomas lowers his sickle. Alice closes her eyes briefly. Margaret throws a few pieces of straw toward John. He throws some back. Their fatigue has not vanished. But something heavy has lifted. The crop is not yet bred. There is still drying, carrying, threshing, winnowing, storing, milling, and all the work that comes afterward. Still, the most urgent part is done. The field stands open beneath the late summer sky. That evening, people gather near the village. The celebration is modest. No wealthy lord has provided mountains of food. No musicians from a distant city have arrived. There is simply more to eat than on an ordinary night. Some ale, a pipe brought out by a man who plays better than expected, and enough space for people to sit together after weeks of intense work. Robert comes. He walks slowly with a stick. When John sees him, he smiles. The old man is thinner than before his fever, but he is upright. Edith has brought something to share. William is already arguing with someone about the weather, despite the fact that, for once, the weather has behaved well. Margaret wears the blue ribbon. Alice pretends not to notice how often she touches it. John carries his knife but keeps it safely closed. Thomas sits near the edge of the gathering. He watches the village. Children chase one another between adults. Someone begins a song. The pipe follows. A woman laughs so loudly that several people turn toward her. The youngest children grow sleepy and are carried closer to fires. For this one evening, the usual careful separation between labor and rest becomes blurred. People have worked together. Now they rest together. John sits beside Robert. The old man asks whether the new knife has cut him yet. John says no. Robert nods. Then perhaps you have learned sense. This time John knows it is a joke. He laughs. The sky deepens from blue to violet. One by one, stars appear. The fair seems long ago. So does the rainy night when the roof leaked. So does the morning when the trader arrived. Yet all of it happened within one season. A medieval life is not made from endless dramatic events. It is made from accumulation. One repaired fence, one loaf, one illness survived, one journey, one Sunday bell, one harvest, one evening beneath the stars. Eventually, Thomas stands. It is time to go home. John is disappointed, but only a little. He has reached the kind of tiredness that makes a familiar bed sound better than music. The family says good night. They walk along the lane. Behind them, voices continue. Ahead, the cottage waits in darkness. Alice enters first and tends the hearth. Thomas closes the door. Margaret removes her ribbon and folds it carefully. John places the knife where he always keeps it. Then the family settles. The village outside becomes quiet. The harvest gathering fades. The fields rest under moonlight. And if you could remain there unseen for a little longer, listening beside the thatched wall, you might hear nothing remarkable at all. A child turning in sleep, an ember settling beneath ash, wind moving softly across straw, an owl calling beyond the churchyard. This is the sound of most history. Not kings speaking from thrones, not armies marching, not chronicles being written, only ordinary people reaching the end of an ordinary day. Thomas will rise again tomorrow. Alice will make the fire. Margaret will work wool between her hands. John will take up his knife. Robert will sit in the sun if the weather allows. Edith will probably complain about prices. The bells will sound. Bread will be broken. Rain will come eventually. Winter will follow summer. Children will grow. Roofs will need repairing again, and long after the names of nearly everyone in this village have disappeared, the fields will remain. The road will remain. Perhaps part of the church will remain. Archaeologists and historians centuries later may recover fragments of pottery, bones, tools, accounts, foundations, pollen, seeds, and written records that allow pieces of these lives to return to view. But no excavation can recover every evening. No document records every laugh. No account roll tells us how warm the sun felt on John's face as he came home from the fair, or whether Margaret looked at her blue ribbon one final time before putting it away. Those details belong to the silence of the past, and perhaps that is why an ordinary day in medieval England is worth visiting, because beneath all the strange customs, unfamiliar obligations, rough houses, dark nights, and distant centuries, there are rhythms we still recognize. Waking, working, eating, worrying about weather, caring for someone who is ill, teaching a child, buying something unnecessary because it brings joy, returning home tired, looking up at stars. So now, dear listener, Midnight Cat pads quietly back toward the doorway between their world and ours. The fire in Thomas and Alice's cottage has sunk to embers. John is asleep. Beyond the repaired thatch, clouds drift slowly across the moon. There is nothing more required of the village tonight. Nothing more required of you either. Let the church bell fade somewhere far across the fields. Let the muddy road disappear into darkness. Let the harvest lie safely beneath the stars, and leave medieval England sleeping peacefully behind us.